Chapter 132 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST. Chapter 132. The Explanation and the Proposal, a Tête-à-Tête. A week or more had passed away since the visit of the attorney to Mrs. Merideth, and yet the latter saw not a sufficient reason why she should send for her friend. Things were not ripe yet. The Colonel had, it was true, been melting gradually, but then to progress ever so little was a great point in anything, no matter what it is, something gained. Mrs. Merideth, however, by no means lost sight of her object. She had that steadily in view, and worked for it every day, and her daughter was no less assiduous. She was attentive and humble, waited upon Colonel Devereux with the affectionate assiduity of a daughter, while, on his part, he sighed and said, what a happy man he must be, who should have her for a wife. It was arranged one day, when he appeared to be more than usually tender, that the mother should be out that evening, and see some of her friends, and break the news a little to some of them, a pardonable vanity in the lady, for it was not in accordance with her position in society that her daughter could expect such an offer as the one she daily expected. The lady did as she had agreed, and left the house, while Margaret went to the Colonel's sitting room when his bell rang, and hoped he'd excuse the absence of her mother, as she had gone out to see some friends whom she had not seen for some time. "I am happy in having you attend to me, Miss Margaret. I cannot be attended to better. I am afraid, as it is, I am a terrible annoyance to you." "Annoyance, Colonel! Far from it, very far from it, and I do hope you do not mean what you say, else I shall fear I have unwillingly given you some cause for your opinion, which I shall the more regret, as you are yourself so kind. I assure you it gives me great pleasure when I know I can do aught to alleviate the misfortunes, or satisfy the wishes of any of my friends." "And do you reckon me one, Miss Margaret?" "I hope Colonel Devereux will not consider me too presumptuous in looking upon him as something more than a mere casual friend or acquaintance." "Casual acquaintance, Miss Margaret, casual acquaintance." "Well, friendship, if you allow me to say so." "Friendship!" repeated the Colonel, with a deep-drawn sigh. "I would I could claim a yet warmer title than a friend. I could then hope for some of those pleasures which are denied a solitary man like me. I should then have those whom I loved to soothe my deathbed, and whom I could benefit by worldly wealth, could I, Margaret, think I could claim a feeling stronger than that of friendship." "Oh, Colonel Devereux, how can you talk in this strain? Indeed you are too good. Dear me, I do not know what I was about to say." "Miss Merideth," said the Colonel, taking her hand with gentleness, and tenderly pressing it, "I am seen to a great disadvantage. I have been many years fighting for my country, and I have not had time to cultivate those sweet and tender emotions such as I feel at this moment." "Yes, you must have suffered much," said Margaret. "And now, when I return again, I am somewhat the worse in appearance; but my heart is as warm as ever it was, and I am more than ever alive to the charm of female society. It is that unreserved interchange of thought and good offices which attaches me to life, and makes me live even with hope. Do not dispel this daydream of mine, Margaret." The Colonel paused and pressed her hand to his lips, while she appeared confused and irresolute, and was unable to withdraw her hand from his, but at length she sank trembling into a chair. "My charming creature, may I suppose this emotion is caused by excess of feeling, in short, I am not wholly indifferent to you?" "Oh, Colonel, I'm really unable to speak." "My beloved girl, I am loved, yes, I see it. Oh, happiness!" Amidst these broken sentences, the Colonel contrived to slip his hand round the young lady's waist, and he pressed her close to him. For a moment she forgot his proximity, and remained passive; but suddenly and quietly disengaging herself, she said, "Pardon me, Colonel Devereux, I had forgotten, I was unconscious, a weakness came over me, and—" "You love me!" If you have become acquainted with that which was a secret, sir, you must use it as such. But you must not talk in this strain to me. Promise me, Colonel, and I will see about the tea immediately." "May I speak to your mother?" "Colonel Deverill can do as he pleases. I have no secrets from my dear mamma." "I will, and heaven bless you for saying so much. I may say you are not averse to me, and that, with her consent, I shall not despair." "We will say no more, Colonel Deverill," said the cautious maiden. "You shall command me. You are the arbitress of my fate," said the Colonel, who had become warmer and eulogistic to a degree. Much more, however, passed between them. The ice was broken, and they conversed more freely; for when they began the tea, much was said that did not partake of so warm a character as that which had already passed, but it, nevertheless, partook of the same purpose. "When I am married," said the Colonel, "I should like a carriage. I have no use for one now, as I could but very seldom ride; but when I had a wife, then I should wish for her accommodation as well as my own. But which do you prefer, country or town life?" "There is much of comfort and quiet in a country life," said Margaret, "and yet I am not entirely wedded to country life. There is much of pleasure in London." "So there is; and where you have no resources of your own, or in your own house, it is preferable; but when such is the case, London loses all its charms, or a great part of them." "So it does," said Margaret. "However, I am partial to both. I should like a partial town and country life." "That, indeed, would be the very greatest delight one could experience, to live sometimes in one place, and sometimes in another." "So it would. By the way, if we kept a carriage, which I would do," said the Colonel, after a pause, "it would be a very excellent thing to enable us to travel about in." "Perhaps you have been to some parts, and like them better than others." "Yes, I have been to a good many parts, but I cannot at this moment speak of them; but we would look out for some place that would be more agreeable than others." "Perhaps you have some place of your own you would like to live in?" "No, not exactly. These things are not of one's own choice, and not empty, and, therefore, are useless as residences." "Certainly. Besides, you must be near enough to come to town for business purposes." "Yes, I must, but that needn't be often," replied the Colonel. "But where there is plenty of means, there is no fear of not getting what we want." "No, indeed, there is not." "And one thing alone would repay me for the hardships I have endured, the misery I have suffered, and the misfortunes I have experienced in all my marchings and countermarchings, my sleeping in the open air by night, and scorched by the sun by day." "And what may that be, Colonel?" "Why, the power it gives me of conferring happiness and wealth upon you; for, in the natural course of events, you will outlive me." "Oh, for mercy's sake, don't talk of that, sir." "But it is a matter that I can think of calmly enough; and, as a soldier, I have ample occasion, I can assure you." "Indeed, I dare say you must have." "I can remember on one occasion especially, which I will relate to you, if I do not weary," said Colonel Deverill. "Oh, no, no! I cannot be weary," said Margaret. "Then I will tell you. I was ordered to march some troops to attack the stockade of Puddingthumpoor, a very strong place." "Was it a town?" "No, merely a place of strength, where the enemy had gathered together in great numbers; and here we were determined to attack them. The stockade was a very strong place, and there were strong and high timber fences, with large mounds of earth and bags of sand, all tending to make the place one of great strength," said the Colonel. "What a place it must have been!" "Yes, it was very strong. Well, my party did not amount to more than 1,500 men strong, while the enemy, with the advantages of the defense, were more than 3,000, giving them a vast superiority over us. But we were not to be daunted by that. We were determined to make a dash, and, from the character of the men I commanded, I had no fear of the result. We were sure to make our way among them, and then we were sure of the result." "How dreadful!" "Well, the men were divided into 3 bodies, 500 each, and these into divisions of 100 each, the one to support the other. We had no guns, and were therefore compelled to depend entirely upon our luck in the assault." "Goodness me! I wonder how you could think of it with anything like ease or comfort. It would make me all of a freeze." "Oh, Margaret, when the soldier is in the field of battle, he must get the better of all feelings, save those of honor." "It is too true," said Margaret with a sigh. "And then," said Colonel Deverill, "we, having arranged our plans, and settled who was to take the command if I had the mischance to fall—" "Good heavens!" "Well, I say, having done all this, we were resolved to make a dash at the point, and take the place by assault. To do this the more effectually, we were resolved to make the attempt in 3 different places at once, so as to divert the enemy's attention, and to place them in a crossfire, and thus take them more easily. This plan was carried out to the letter, and we made the attack; but the enemy defended their stockade so vigorously, and what with the strength of the place and the determination of the enemy, we were for some time repulsed, at least held at bay. This would never do, I thought. I must mount the breach myself, for if my division was held at bay, I had fears of the rest. They might meet repulses also, which would occasion the loss of our whole party, which would have been sure destruction. Not defeat alone, but imprisonment, and possibly death from ill usage, or from malignant disorders." "What fearful scenes!" "I ordered my men to keep close and follow me. We made a dash at the stockade, 3 abreast, and up we went. By Jove, it was fine work, a brave sight, a sight I can never forget while I have remembrance left me. We got up the stockade heaven knows how, and were over it in the space of a minute; but the impetuosity of those who came first was not seconded by those who came after. It was easy enough to get down among the Indians, but it was very hard to get up; and while our friends were getting up, we were exposed to the strength of hundreds, only 4 men to as many hundreds for several minutes." "Goodness, how dreadful! Were you not all killed?" "Except for myself, they were all killed. Each received a dozen wounds, and I should have met with the same fate, but for an Indian officer who, seeing me surrounded and thrown down, saved my life from the fury of his men. But, in a minute after, I was free, my own men came down by dozens, and the blacks were swept off by the hundred. At that moment, too, there were our other parties just appearing over the other parts of the stockade, so we had now plenty of assistance. The blacks now on all sides fell in numbers before the fire, and the place was our own, and a hearty cheer was given that made the woods re-echo again." "Were you not glad the danger was over?" "The danger was not over, though we thought it was; for suddenly the earth heaved up with a tremendous explosion, and many of our poor fellows were blown up into the air, and I myself was completely knocked over and smothered in dirt. However, it was dry, and we were soon put to rights again. I was picked up, and nothing more happened." "What was the cause of your disaster?" "Oh, a mine the scamps had sprung as they were retiring, hoping to do us more mischief than they did. However, we beat them off, and they lost many men on that occasion, and did not show themselves again, but made the best of their way through the woods and jungle by some paths that we did not know, and hence we did not follow them further." "It must have been dreadfully dangerous." "Yes, life was the game we played for, and it was won and lost often enough during that war; but we must expect it should be so." "But you are now safe." "Yes, I am now safe, and, I may say, happy. I have had some knocks, and am none the better for them bodily; but then I have had them well paid for, so I must not complain. I have now but one object to attain before I die." "And what may that be, Colonel, if it be no secret?" "It is not to you, Miss Meredith," said the Colonel. "It is an early day, a day on which I may claim you as my own; then, indeed, I shall have lived and accomplished something; an object worth living for, and, may I say so, worth dying for." "Ah, I hope you may live many years yet, Colonel, many years of life and happiness, to enjoy the fortune you have so gallantly won. Indeed, I think no fortune ought to give so much joy as the soldier's." "And why, Miss Meredith?" because there is none so arduously won, won often with bloodshed, and even life. It ought, indeed, to give great and lasting happiness." "If I obtain my wishes, I shall be the happiest man in the universe; and I would go through all I have gone through over, aye, twice over, and that is no little, to have such a reward as the one I now seek. It is the crowning happiness of my life." "You are very kind to say all this—" "Aye, but I mean it. It is no common compliment," said the Colonel. "I mean what I say, most earnestly. Do you believe what I say? I am not used to the pretty speeches of young men who make love; perhaps I ought, but I am an old soldier, and am but little used to these ways. However, I have spoken my mind, and I hope you will not allow anyone else to injure my cause." "Anything you have said, Colonel Devereux, has been of too serious a nature for me to think of anything save the object itself. Your conduct has been that of a gentleman, and I should be wanting in respect to myself, and courtesy to you, to think otherwise than seriously of it," was the wily reply of Margaret. "You have my own thoughts," said the Colonel. "There is my ma," said Margaret, as the knocker and bell sounded. "You will do your utmost with Mrs. Merideth for me, and I will beseech her myself," said the Colonel. "I hope she will take things in a favorable light." Chapter 133 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 133. Mrs. Merideth's Consultation with Mr. Twistle, and Her Resolve. Mrs. Merideth's arrival was very opportune, for it broke off the interview; and Margaret descended to the parlor, where her mother she knew would repair the moment she had freed herself from her dress. Margaret was now left alone for a few moments. She felt all the exultation of success in a strategy, and all the exhilaration of spirits that such a prospect of wealth and riches floating before her eyes, and all the natural consequence upon such possessions, would give rise to. "I shall be rich," she thought. "Aye, I shall not only be rich, but very rich. I know I shall. Well, he is old. No matter, better be an old man's darling than a young man's slave. Yes, I shall know how to use wealth. I shall be able to spend a little of his countless hoards, and he will not thwart me, I am sure. He will be too fond, too doting, by far. I shall be indulged like a spoiled child, I am sure." Margaret smiled at the thought of what length the Colonel might not be induced to carry his fondness for her. "He will not set any value upon what will give me pleasure. I am sure he will give me all I ask. I have but to ask him for what I want, and he must comply. I am sure he is too easy, too quiet and generous to make a moment's hesitation." The Colonel, too, was left to his reflections, but as to what they were we know not. He sat long, silently gazing at the fire. Mrs. Merideth now entered the apartment, and, looking at her daughter, she said: "Eh, something's been said, Margaret? I can see by your eye that the Colonel has said something to you. Am I not right, my dear?" "Yes, ma, you are right." "Well, my love, what did he say? I am dying with curiosity." "It will be quite impossible to do that, but he has been quite explicit enough, without any hesitation at all, or any reserve; quite candid and open." "He has offered?" "Yes. He wishes for your consent; for I told him I could not possibly decide without your consent and countenance. He did not disapprove of that, only he wished to propitiate you in his favor, and begged me to let him have the satisfaction of knowing that he had my good wishes, and that I could look upon him in a warmer light than a mere friend." "Which I hope you did?" "Yes, ma. I let him imagine that I was not indifferent to his good opinion; but, at the same time, I would not commit myself, but left him to infer a good deal. I think I know, ma, how to manage such an affair well; I may say, very well." "Exactly, my love. I was sure you would." "Yes, ma, I should think I did. for when I found he had proceeded a certain distance, I was resolved that he should speak out plump at once, and when I found he paused, I paused too, and he was compelled to explain; but he betrayed no unwillingness, or anything like hesitation at all, but he has fairly proposed himself to me." "And you have not committed yourself?" "Not in the least." "Very well, I must be cautious too not to do so, because I must have some conversation with Mr. Twistle, so that we may proceed in a safe manner, and not commit ourselves in any way as we shall repent of afterwards." "How do you mean?" "Why, child, you would not marry the Colonel if he was not a rich man." "Not exactly, though I must admit, Ma, he is a very nice man, and I should be entitled to a widow's pension if nothing more, and that I might not have under some circumstances. Even you yourself have been left worse off, you see." "Yes, my child, but circumstances alter cases. I had a better prospect when I first married, else I would not have done so, you may depend upon it. However, we can always retrace our steps, and he cannot. But I will get Mr. Twistle to come and see into matters a bit for us." "Well, Ma, you shall do as you think fit. Only, take care not to throw away a good chance because you have greater hopes." "Has he said anything about his property?" "Not a word, except to intimate it was large, and he had won it very hardly, with great danger. But he did not say what it consisted of. Of course I could not ask." "Oh, dear, no." "But he intimated he would keep a carriage, and a country house, as well as a town house, besides several other matters, which makes it plain enough he has been used to plenty. Besides, as he spoke to me in describing some scenes in India, he appeared so much animated that I am sure he must be what he appears to be, and what he says he is." "Ah, well, I think myself it is all quite right, and that we shall have nothing to repent here; but we will let all go on but the naming of the day. That must not be named, for, if we do, we shall not be able to retract." "Oh, no, we shall not have any occasion to do that, I think; but I dare say he will speak to you to night, if there is time at supper especially." "No doubt. You may as well retire early so that you may be absent, and that will give us greater liberty to talk than if you were present, my dear. I wish Mr. Twistle were here, but it can't be helped; and when he does come, I must have some conversation with him, and I must, in the meantime, learn what I can for him to inquire about afterwards." Thus resolved, Margaret went to bed early, leaving her mother to attend upon the Colonel, who sat looking at the fire without any change of posture since the last time he was seen by the girl. But Mrs. Merideth caused him to break the steady gaze and deep thought he was indulging in. "I hope you have been quite well, Colonel, since I left?" "Yes, quite well, Mrs. Merideth." "What would you choose for supper?" "Margaret." "Eh?" said Mrs. Merideth, amazed. "I beg your pardon, I did not know you were near; at least, I did not know I spoke at the moment. But pray what did you desire to know?" "What you would have for supper, sir." "Oh, whatever you have at hand, some of what we had for dinner. I think I should like it as soon as you feel disposed to have it. I am ready, quite ready." "Then it shall be had at once, sir," said Mrs. Merideth. "I will order it up immediately, for it is later than I intended to have stopped out; but the hours so soon ran away, and there were so many motives to forget the time that was flying so fast." The supper was soon laid, and the Colonel and Mrs. Merideth alone sat down to it, at his earnest request. Indeed, they used to have meals much in common, for the Colonel professed to be very fond of female company, and was desirous of their company, which they translated into a desire for the presence of Margaret herself. The supper was laid and over before the Colonel said anything, but appeared to be absorbed in deep thought, from which it was difficult to arouse himself; but at length, after looking around once or twice, and not seeing Margaret at table, he said to Mrs. Merideth: "I hope I have not driven your daughter away." "Oh, no, sir; she complains of headache, and has gone to bed somewhat earlier than usual." "I fear I must lay the blame on myself." "She did not say you were the cause," replied Mrs. Merideth, "of her ailment; and therefore, I think you must be free from blame; for she would have said so, if it had so happened. She generally speaks the truth in such matters, at least, and, I believe, in every other." "No doubt; but I have been speaking upon a subject that concerns my own happiness to her, and perhaps the excitement may have caused her some evil of that sort. She would not, perhaps, name it to you, Mrs. Meredith, but I will. You have been a wife yourself, and know that a few candid words are better, and more to the purpose, than a long desultory courtship." "Yes, sir, it certainly is so." "There is some difference, too, in our ages," said the Colonel. "I have not overlooked that matter, at all events; but I hope that will be no cause of impediment or objection." "It cannot be, sir, in such a case as your own, for instance." "Well, then, I have proposed for her husband. I wish to make her my wife. I am yet hale and hearty, and have some few years yet which I could wish to pass in happiness, and which I will use to make her happy; and if I die early, I have ample means of providing for her, of leaving her a most handsome and ample fortune. Not more than she deserves, but probably more than she might have thought of seeking." "Certainly, sir." "Then I wish for your consent to our future happiness." "You may have my good wishes," said Mrs. Meredith. "You are very good," said the Colonel, "and I trust your daughter will live long to make you happy by making her own apparent to you." "Of course," said Mrs. Meredith, "it is rather a sudden affair. You will not think of hurrying it to a conclusion, but permit her to become acquainted with you, and to know her own mind." "Certainly I do wish it pushed on to a conclusion, but not so much so as to cause any dissatisfaction. I am anxious to call her wife. My feelings are those of an ardent lover." "I do not dispute it." "Still you and she must be the best judges of all this. You will not, I hope, punish me by compelling me to a longer probation than you are compelled to put me to. I am not like a young man who has a fortune, or rather a living to earn; but I have one ready, a handsome one, and my wife will be a lady of fortune when I die." "Do not think of dying at such a moment, sir." "Why, it is not desirable," said the Colonel, who did not deem it necessary to carry the conversation on any further that night, thinking, possibly, enough had been said for the first occasion of revealing his passion, and he, no doubt, considered his success signal. The dinner then passed off in the usual style, and Mrs. Meredith left the Colonel, and wished him good night, with feelings somewhat akin to triumph, and returned to her own daughter's room, there to cogitate and sleep upon what had that evening taken place. The next day she determined to send to Mr. Twistle, and arrange the meeting she desired; and, at the same time, she resolved that she would not push matters to the extremity of making a point of knowing what his property were, for she might lose all. She was convinced that the Colonel must be a man of large property; how could such a man live if he were not? It was a speculation she could not help indulging in. She knew that a man in Colonel Deverell's line of life was quite able to support himself; besides, the jewels he had about him were worth a large sum of money. Putting all things together, she considered it was not worth while to lose so good, so excellent an opportunity as the present for making a brilliant, at least an excellent settlement for her daughter, and a home for herself. "There can be no fear," she muttered, "there can be no fear; her widow's pension will be a better support to her than the livelihood of some." Mr. Twistle was sent for, and the papers she desired to find for him, she was fortunate enough to discover, and laid them by at once. The attorney came willingly enough, and was well pleased when he was informed of the success of the search after the papers, and produced the bond, by which she agreed to give him £100 for his assistance in the marriage affair. However, he did not seem to agree with her, that she should not be over particular about the Colonel's property. He thought that there must be some inquiries made respecting it, to ascertain if there were any or none. "But," suggested Mrs. Meredith, "the Colonel is a kind but a proud man, and he would, probably, take great and deep offence at any inquiry being made into his pecuniary affairs." "Hardly, my dear madam. Don't you see, love would be strong enough to counterbalance that. He would make some allowance for paternal anxiety and love." "There is much reason in all that. Yet I have heard so much of these nabobs, that one is afraid to lose a good chance by inadvertently touching their weak points; for the kind of society and company they have, theirs is so indifferent to what they find here." "Yes, that is very true; but we should like to know that it is true. What service has he been in? I think, though, you said in the East India Service?" "Yes." "Well, then, I will make some inquiries at the house. They will answer my inquiries, and no one will even be the wiser for it. They will, at least, tell me if there is such a person in the service; and, perhaps, I can learn something more." "Very well, that may be done. Will you come round with me to tea this evening, as I will contrive to bring you in the presence of Colonel Devereux, whom you will then see and converse with? I am not sure of it, but I will try to do so." "I will be here," said the Attorney, "and in the meantime I will make the necessary inquiries." They parted upon this mutual good understanding, and the Attorney in high spirits, for the papers were of great value to him, and the promised reward was a stimulus to a greater exertion on behalf of Mrs. Merideth and her daughter, for he thought he could do business for the Colonel, after this affair was settled; such an opportunity of increasing his connection did not offer every day. Mrs. Merideth redoubled her assiduity about the person of Colonel Devereux, and, at the same time, lost no opportunity of putting her daughter forward; nor was that daughter a bit disinclined to take such opportunity as was offered her, of making the most of herself on this occasion to appear amiable, and in some new and languishing position, or to perform some new service for the Colonel. CHAPTER 134 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 134. The Introduction, the Attorney's First Feeler. When the Attorney had left the house, he proceeded upon some business of his own, and then he proceeded to the India House for the purpose of making inquiries after the Colonel, for his friend Mrs. Merideth. In the course of the day he did go to the India House, and, upon making some inquiries, he was sent to a particular department of the house where he saw two gentlemen. "Pray, sir," said one, "what do you want?" "I wish to make some inquiries concerning a Colonel Devereux, who is employed, or was serving, in the Honourable East India Service." "In what part was he serving?" "In India," said the Attorney. "But to what presidency did he belong?" "That I do not even know. He has been many years away from England, I understand, and some of his friends have not heard from him for many years, and they were desirous of finding out whether he is dead or alive, and if so, where he is." "There is a Colonel Devereux returned this year from India." "Indeed! Do you know anything of him?" "Nothing more than he has retired from the service on his half pay, some time before he came home, on account of his wounds." "Is he rich?" "I can answer no such question." "I am a solicitor, and do not ask the question from an improper motive." "You may not, sir, but we cannot answer such a question. We have no inquisitorial knowledge of the private circumstances of these gentlemen who have served in the company's army; but, you put it to your own sagacity to consider how far it would be probable for a man so placed, as regards rank and opportunity, in India, without making money." "I see. Certainly. He must." "And yet, you know, there are means of getting rid of money." "To be sure. I see." "Not that I have any idea that such can be the case. Indeed, I should be disposed to believe the contrary, seeing the Colonel must have been wounded long since; for the last engagement must have been some few years since." "Thank you. I will report what I have learned. Do you not know where he can be found at this time?" "No, indeed. We have no information." This being all he could learn, he left the India House, and as it was now about time to return to Mrs. Merideth, he at once went back, and having seen all his business transacted, he had now leisure to go there, and in a short time he arrived, and at once related to her all that he had heard respecting the Colonel, from the first to the last word of it. "Well," said Mrs. Merideth, "that, at all events, is very satisfactory." "Yes, it is something," said the Attorney, "to know your man; but, as the clerk said, he might have spent it, that is to say, dissipated it." "Oh, it's impossible. He's been an invalid a long while now." "Ah, there's no knowing what might be done in these cases. Who knows what he may have done, gambled and diced it away, and entered into extravagant speculations, which may have turned out ruinous bubbles." "Well, well, Mr. Twistle, we won't say much about what might be," said Mrs. Merideth. "We don't care about them. But I am very much obliged to you for this trouble. It is, however, a very satisfactory thing to know he is what he represented himself to be." "Yes, that is a very great point gained." "His veracity having been found unimpeachable in one point, may be presumed to be so in another," said Margaret. "It appeared to me to be extremely probable, if not quite certain, he is what he appears to be. I am glad that all is so far good." "Be that as it may, it will be more satisfactory to know what his property really consists of, and how much there is about it." "No doubt; but it would not be worth while to risk anything on that account. He might imagine we were mercenary, and that would disgust him altogether." "That is what I am fearful of," said the mother. "We may not yet have occasion to ask him any question, or to make any inquiries of him at all, for we may be able to worm it all out of him." "That is true," said Mrs. Merideth. "Dear me, there is the bell. Go, Margaret, and say we have an old friend come to tea. Perhaps he will excuse you. He may give the invitation we desire." Margaret at once departed, and proceeded to the Colonel's room, and began to wait upon him as usual. But he saw there was but one cup placed. "Are you not going to take tea with me, Margaret?" he said. "Am I to be a prisoner, and put in solitary confinement for the evening?" "Why, Colonel, Mr. Twistle has called to take tea with my mother, and he was a very old and particular acquaintance of my father's. I do not like to put a slight upon him." "He is a gentleman, I presume?" "Oh, yes, Colonel, he is a member of the profession of the law." "Oh! Well, will you ask him to tea with me? As we shall be both united, I hope your friends will soon be mine. There can be no great objection to our acquaintance beginning earlier. I am not fond of being entirely alone." "If we shall not be intruding upon you, sir," said Margaret, "I dare say my mother will. I will tell her of your kindness immediately." In a few moments Margaret returned to her mother and the Attorney, to whom she related the invitation she had received from the Colonel, and instantly clutched at the idea of going to the Colonel to tea, the thing of all others she most desired to do, and, at the same time, she had calculated upon it; for the Colonel appeared to be wholly dependent upon them for society, which he appeared to be passionately fond of there, especially Margaret. "That is just fortunate. Now, Mr. Twistle," said Mrs. Merideth, "you will be cautious, and do not make any open attempt to discover what may be the peculiar species of property he holds. It may do much mischief, you know." "I am at your mercy," said the lawyer. "If you say so, I will not make any attempt, though I must tell you, Mrs. Merideth, that you will be to blame if you allow your daughter to marry without some inquiry being made, and if he mean well, he will take no offense." "You may do what you can without broaching the subject to him; still I think we have heard enough to set all doubts at rest." "I'm a professional man, my dear madam, and I know what the world is, and have had much experience in these matters. However, as I think there is much probability in all he says, why, you shall see I will not do anything that will offend the nicest delicacy." "That will be all we want, Mr. Twistle, and now come upstairs." "Mr. Twistle, Colonel Deverell; Colonel Deverell, Mr. Twistle, an old and dear friend of my late husband, sir, who has called to visit us." "I am very happy to see the gentleman," said the Colonel, but with the air of a man who is conscious of his own superiority, and that he is committing a condescending act. "Will you please to be seated. Excuse my rising, sir. I am an invalid, and am lame; but you are welcome." "I am much obliged," returned the attorney, bowing. "My good friend Mrs. Merideth has made me intrude upon you, else I had not done so." "You are welcome, sir," again repeated Colonel Devereux. "Pray be seated. I have seen but little company, and am glad now and then to converse with any one. Will you oblige me, Mrs. Merideth, with making tea for us? Your services are really invaluable." "Ah, Colonel, you are really too good." "Not at all. I'm afraid I'm too much in the rear of the march of courtesy since I left England, as our habits and manners in the East are very different to what they are here." "Ah, I dare say they live in a style of regal magnificence and splendor," said the attorney. "Yes, more so than you may at first imagine, and more so than in appearance; so much so that it is difficult for the law at all times to take its course. It becomes a mere dead letter, and the matter usually ends in some indignity being offered to its servants." "Indeed, sir, that was dangerous." "Not at all. It was an attorney, who having deputed some one to serve a process, and finding that he could not, imagined that it was the fault of the process server, and he determined to make the attempt himself, being well assured that he could succeed. However, he found himself mistaken; for, after several disasters, that he was led into purposely, he was well pumped upon by some slaves, and thought himself lucky in escaping with life." "That would never have been permitted here," said the attorney. "No, possibly not; but there are not the distinctions between classes here that there are there, and things are not on the same scale, either living or attendance." "And yet, people who have passed their lives there, come to this country at last, they do not like it well enough to remain there; they come back to the land of their birth, where none of these things exist to fascinate them." "Yes, they many live and die there, very many; but, at the same time, those who do return, do so because it is the land of their birth; because they love the country, and because they go there merely to make fortunes to come here and spend them." "They don't like the kind of investments, perhaps?" "They usually do so, and it fetches a high price; a very high price, and is considered equal to the stocks of the Bank of England." "That is first rate stock, and on dividend days the place is usually surrounded with strangers, who come to town for the purpose of receiving their incomes. Indeed, it is quite an interesting sight to strangers. Have you ever witnessed it? It is well worth the while to go and see it." "I never trouble myself anything about it," said the Colonel. "But I must be going there, by the way, to morrow. I must have a coach." "Do you know the routine of the banking business? It is confusing to one not used to it." "I know enough for my own purpose." "Didn't you find London much altered?" inquired Margaret, anxious to give a turn to the conversation, as she thought the attorney's conversation would appear as if it were much too pointed. "When you first returned to England, and came to live here again?" "I cannot say much about that," said the Colonel, "because I was not in a condition to twist about like many men. I am lame." "Exactly; that must have deprived you of much of the pleasure one feels in surveying old places and well remembered spots." "It was," replied the Colonel; "but in a place like London, alterations and additions are not so extensive as to cause any alteration in general features, so as to make it perceivable at once. It is only when you come to examine localities that you notice it. You improve and alter parts, but the town is the same, and there is no doubt this appears the work of steady growth, and not any one of sudden effort. Indeed, the very additions to it have a character which stamp it as being London." "There is much truth about that," said the attorney. "It is the same all over the world, and only in those places where the extent is but small, then any great alteration makes a conspicuous and general change, and gives a new character to the place." As this conversation passed between them, the attorney making one or two delicate allusions to property, and asking his advice respecting some purchases he wished to make; to all which the Colonel made but short and direct answers, and of such character, that it was difficult to carry the conversation upon that topic at least, and both mother and daughter looked beseechingly at him, so that he was compelled to resist, and found himself completely baffled by what appeared the Colonel's pride. "Well, Mrs. Merideth," said Mr. Twistle, "I have done my utmost with this Colonel Devereux, and I can make nothing of him; nothing at all, I assure you." "You cannot form a bad opinion of him?" "No, no. He is at one moment one of the most agreeable men to converse with, and the next moment he is frigid and severe; perhaps pain, or perhaps contempt for any one else, may induce the alteration in his manner, and no allusion to himself does he make." "Don't you think he is quite the gentleman, and a man used to good society?" "Yes, I cannot doubt. He has the air of all that he says. But he is going to the bank to morrow. Now, I wonder if it is to receive dividends?" "I dare say it is," said Mrs. Merideth. "I have very little doubt of that, and yet I should very much like to know. It would settle one's mind. Not that I would run any risk about the matter. I would not have him offended for the world. It would be wilfully destroying a chance that is so good, that we can never expect it to again occur, therefore we must not lose it." "Certainly not. I will undertake the matter myself," said the Attorney, "so that there shall not be any risk in a miscarriage whatever. I shall take care that nothing shall be done that will be at all likely to reach his ears, or that will be displeasing to him." "We will trust to your prudence, Mr. Twistle." "You may do so safely, and depend upon my caution in this matter. Now I will be at hand in the morning. If I am not here before he goes out, send for me, and let me know the hour. If there is not time to reach here, send me the number of the coach. I will post off to the bank, and there await until I see him come there." "I will send to you then," said Mrs. Merideth. "I think that a very good plan." "But what will it do for you if you do see him enter the bank? That will tell you nothing, and I cannot see the utility of it," said Margaret. "Many people go into the Bank of England, who do not go there to receive any money for themselves, so that would be inconclusive." "It would," said the Attorney, "but you must remember I can enter too, and ascertain to what portion of the building he goes, and I can learn how much he received, if any. But I must bid you good bye, for the present. Do not forget to send to me at the first blush of the affair, and then much subsequent trouble may be saved." Chapter 135
of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 135. Mr. Twistle's Misadventures. The consequences of being found in the bank without giving a satisfactory account of your business there. An unpleasant dilemma. The peculiar position of Mrs. Merideth and her daughter Margaret, in some measure, and to some degree, tied their hands, and caused a corresponding desire to know more than was told them. At the same time, they were fearful of giving any offence to their new and wealthy lodger. They were both avaricious and designing. To make a good settlement was the grand object of their lives, and to that object they would sacrifice themselves, at least sacrifice Margaret, who, by the by, would consider it no sacrifice at all, but a great stroke of good luck. However, they could do nothing of themselves. They saw there was a great and glorious chance for the future. They felt they had entangled the Colonel. They felt he had become a victim to their snares, and they were unwilling that they should run any risk of a failure of their plans. If we offend him, he may consider us avaricious and designing, they argued, and that might prove too strong an antidote to even an old man's love, and the prize might be snatched out of our hands, and we might not only lose a rich husband, but a good lodger also. These considerations induced them to act more warily and cautious than the attorney, Mr. Twistle, who was anxious at once to seize the bull by the horns and come to an explanation, and thus save himself much labor and time, for the sooner there was an explanation the better, and he did not apprehend the result that they did. He believed it would only appear proper caution on the part of a mother. They had different opinions, and between the two there was an indecisive policy adopted which occasioned delay and uncertainty. There was no doubt but the Colonel meant matrimony. His infirmities were of no consequence. It was not the man, but the money, that was wanted, and which was sought with perseverance and constancy. They appeared negligent of money matters before the Colonel, and when he paid them, which he did regularly, he always appeared to have money about him, which of course increased their respect, and gave them increased confidence in him. "It is all very well, Ma," said Margaret, "but Mr. Twistle must not offend Colonel Deverill. He is evidently a man much above him. His actions and manner are such that at once stamp him immeasurably his superior. Now, as regards this property, there can be no doubt but he must have enough." "I think so too, my dear, but it would be a dreadful thing if it should turn out otherwise in the end. It would really be very dreadful. I should never survive it." "Nor I, mother." "What is to be done? I declare I am at my wits' end." "There is no fear, Ma. Do you not remember that Mr. Twistle himself has found out that he is Colonel Deverill, and that he has retired from the army of the company?" "Indeed, my dear, that is correct. I had forgotten that, quite forgotten it, but it may so happen he has no money at all. He may have spent it." "He does not appear to be extravagant," said Margaret. "He has retired upon his half pay, which you know must be a very good living, and I am sure of a widow's pension if nothing more, and besides I am sure, from what he has said, there must be money." "Well, I think so too, my dear," said Mrs. Merideth, "and I think it will be better that things should go on as the Colonel desires. To lose him would be horribly aggravating." "So it will, Ma, because I am sure he will do justice. It is not like as if we had money too, and were as willing to have our affairs investigated as we are to investigate his." "That is very true, my dear, very true. And Mr. Twistle does not seem to know that. That I will tell him when I see him. By the way, I must send to him to tell him the Colonel is going out in about an hour. If he can find out anything, without compromising us in the affair, why he may do so, and welcome, for you must acknowledge it will be all the more satisfactory." "Yes, yes, I admit that, but I would not wilfully lose a good opportunity." "I must now send off to him. Mary must go, and that too, as quickly as she can, for I shall want her back again very soon, so she must run." "Then the sooner she goes the better," said Margaret. Mary was sent to Mr. Twistle, who happened to be at home at the time, and judging that Mary had been a good time on the road, that there would be no time to go to Mrs. Merideth's house, then follow the coach, so he determined to go to the bank at once, so that he would be there in time to see the Colonel descend and enter the bank, into which he would follow him. He sent word back to Mrs. Merideth that he would go on and see her as soon as he could, and then he made the best of his way towards the bank, where he arrived in good time, indeed, half an hour before the Colonel, who did not set out so soon as he intended. "Now," thought Twistle, "if he were to turn out all right, why, I shall be in good fortune, but if bad, it would be laid upon my shoulders. They shall not say that I have not given them attention enough for their money, and if I don't do something, they will say I haven't earned my money, and though I can enforce payment of the bond, yet it may hurt my future prospects with regard to my future connection with the family, which I hope to make a profitable one in the long run." Filled with these thoughts, he determined to watch with due caution for the arrival of the Colonel on the other side of the way. It was some long time before the coach drove up, which it did after a considerable lapse of time, and then Mr. Twistle crossed over, and placed himself in a position by the lamp post, where he should obtain a good view of any one passing in and out of the coach. "'Tis he muttered as he saw the Colonel step out of the carriage, and walk into the bank very leisurely and quietly, leaning upon his stick, and walking lame. He watched him into the bank. He saw him go some distance down the passage, and then he muttered, 'Now I will follow him up closely.' And, after a moment's pause to permit someone to pass him, he then darted down the passage into a kind of yard. But no, he could not see him. He was not there. And yet he was so lame, he could not have got out of sight so soon as all that. 'He's gone to the dividend office,' he muttered. 'I shall find him there.' And away he posted to that department, but he could not find him. He was not there. Then what could have become of him? That was a point he could not solve. 'Well, this is very odd,' he muttered, 'very odd.' He paused to think over the matter, but that did not aid him. He was in the dark, but thought it was no use in waiting in any one place, so wandered about from office to office until he came to the body of the place, when he waited until someone came up to him and touched him on the shoulder. He turned around, and at once perceived it was an officer. "What do you want with me?" inquired Twistle. "What is your business here?" returned the officer, by way of reply. "I am here upon my own business. I am at a loss to understand what you mean by asking me such a question in a public place. What can you mean by it? I was never asked such a question before, and cannot see why you should do so now." "Excuse me, sir, I have ample warrant for what I am doing." "Have you? Then state it." "Easily. I have followed you about this last half hour, and you have been wandering about the place for some time, and looking about you in a manner that has excited a good deal of suspicion, to say the least of it, and I must have some satisfactory explanation." "You can have that," replied Mr. Twistle, very much annoyed. "You can have any explanation you require. I am very sure I came here on my own affairs. What other explanation can you require?" "Your affairs may be ours also, and the explanation you have given will be just enough to justify my taking you into custody. So if you have no more to say, I must request the favor of your company. That's my card of invitation. Do you hear, sir?" "Yes, I do. I am an attorney at law, and you may depend upon it I will not be content without punishing you for this indignity. I came in here because I saw a friend call to whom I wanted to speak." "Where is he?" "I don't know," said Twistle. "I have missed him." "Very likely, and your friend will miss you for a short time, for you must come with me. You have been found here without being able to give any account of yourself." "I tell you I came in here to see Colonel Deverill." "Well, what do we know of Colonel Deverill? We don't know anything about him, nor you either. You must come with me. We are obligated to be very particular when we see strangers walking about with no object whatever in view. It is very suspicious." "But I tell you I am a respectable attorney, a professional man. I had no bad object in view." "That may be as you say, but you must come with me." Seeing there no help for it, Mr. Twistle resigned himself into the officer's hands, and followed him to the station house, where he was examined by the inspector at the place where he was taken. "Well, sir," said the inspector, "this may be all very true, but we must have some proof of what you assert. Then we can let you go." "I'll have a complaint against you." "You may, but you must prove not only that what you say is true, but that there was no cause for suspicion, and that you were not loitering about the bank, as the officer asserts you were." The attorney thought it would be quite unnecessary to get into the public prints, because it would not do for him to make use of Colonel Deverill's name, and that he had already done. What was he to do? He had got into a very disagreeable scrape, out of which he must now get in the best manner possible, and which he could not see his way clear to do. "What do you want me to do?" "Give us some proof that you are the person whom you represent yourself to be," he replied, "and then we can let you go at once." "Then I will give you my card," said Twistle, producing his card case. "That is no proof," said the constable. "A man might have robbed you of your card case, and you would have some one passing himself off for yourself." "What shall I do, then?" inquired Twistle. "Send for someone who knows you, or send for your own clerk. That will do." "That I can do at once," replied Twistle, and he at once wrote a note to his clerk, and gave it unsealed into the hands of the constable, and asked if there was anyone who would go with it. "You can send a messenger. There are many who will do that if you pay them for it," replied the constable, and in another minute, for the sum of half a crown, a messenger agreed to take the letter to his office, and deliver it to his clerk, and wait for him. This was done, and until that time he was locked up in a cell, where he had a light certainly, but in which he had no other comfort at all. But in about an hour and a half there was a prospect of a relief, for he saw his clerk come into the station house, and with him the messenger, who came to the constable, and said that this was Mr. Twistle's clerk. "Do you know Mr. Twistle?" inquired the constable. "Yes, I do. He is my employer." "Then point him out," said the constable. At that moment Mr. Twistle was brought in, and he at once pointed him out to the satisfaction of the constable, who, with an admonition, consented to the enlargement of Mr. Twistle, and in answer to his threat of future investigation, said to him, "You see, sir, the bank is such a place, that we are compelled to keep all persons out who have no business there, and it must not be a place where people meet who have no particular bank business to transact. Do not wait about, then, for the future, sir, else you may run the same danger." Mr. Twistle left the station house with a feeling very much akin to anger, and he walked home with a very disagreeable feeling. He felt that he had been baffled, and had been also much ill-used and very much affronted. "Where could he have got to?" he murmured. "He must have turned in some of the offices. Confound him! I wish he had taken it into his head to tumble. I am sure he ain't no good. If he were, I should not have been placed in such an unpleasant position." Suddenly he recollected that there was no necessity for his going home, unless there had been anything happened since his departure, and upon being informed that such was not the case, he determined to alter his course, and proceed to Mrs. Merideth, and relate the misfortunes that had befallen him. "And if that don't satisfy her I have her interest at heart, why nothing will." And he left his clerk, after giving him some directions, and then turned off towards Bloomsbury Square, where he arrived just before tea time. End of chapter 135. Read by Richard Wallace, Liberty, Missouri, 4 March 2010. Chapter 136 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 136. An Evening with Colonel Deverill, the Stratagem of Mrs. Merideth. Mr. Twistle seated himself by Mrs. Merideth's fire, not at all pleased with what he had anticipated and expected on that day, and yet well pleased that there was an end to it, but at the same time he had conceived a dislike for the Colonel, of which the reader can easily guess the reason. The Colonel had received him rather haughtily, and he was annoyed at it, and he was resolved that he would do him no service, and now the indignity he had received was so vexing that he knew not on whom to wreak his anger. At all events it gave him a great dislike to the Colonel, which would require a considerable time to overcome. He sat there waiting for Mrs. Merideth, who was then engaged somewhere else, but it was not long before she entered the apartment in which Mr. Twistle sat meditating upon his misadventure, and considering in his own mind what would be the best course to pursue. "Oh, Mr. Twistle," she said, "I hope you have not been waiting long for me." "Not long, ma'am." "And how have you got on today, Mr. Twistle?" "Rather indifferently indeed," said Twistle with a groan. "I may say very indifferently indeed. I have had plenty of incident, I may say of adventure, I ought to say misadventure, which appears to have dogged me step by step in this affair." "Indeed? I am amazed at that," said Mrs. Merideth. "You would be more so if you knew all." "Tell me what has happened, Mr. Twistle," said Mrs. Merideth. "I am anxious to hear what can have happened to you of this character. I hope it did not happen in consequence of your doing anything in this affair of Colonel Deveril's." "Indeed it did, Mrs. Merideth," said the attorney solemnly. "I have been sedulously engaged in this affair, and I have been seriously inconvenienced by it." "I regret it very much." "But you could not have helped it, Mrs. Merideth," said Twistle. "You could not have helped it at all. I know that very well. Therefore there is no blame attached to you. You are free. But I have suffered nevertheless. I have suffered." "Dear me, how sorry I am, to be sure." "Yes, ma'am, but it can't be helped. I was taken into custody as a suspicious person, and had some difficulty in getting my release from custody." Mrs. Merideth lifted her hands and her eyes to express the amount of astonishment she felt. "Yes, Mrs. Merideth, I followed the Colonel into the Bank of England, and there I saw him enter, but by some wonderful means he suddenly disappeared. I missed him, and could not again obtain the slightest clue to him. I did not again set eye upon him, and, while endeavouring to regain the track, I was taken into custody for loitering about." "Indeed? Then you have learned nothing about the Colonel?" "Nothing at all. I missed him. I saw him going into the bank, and that was all." "Well, he has come back, and appears to have received money. I should think that there could be no doubt as to where he got it from." "It is a mystery." "Indeed, I should hardly think it possible, as you saw him go in. What would he go there for but for money matters? It seems clear enough to me. I have no doubt in my own mind. Everything appears to be straightforward and plain." "Indeed," muttered the attorney, "there is much truth in that. I have had a straightforward intimation that I have been considered a suspicious person. I regret it very much, but here's Margaret." At that moment Margaret entered the apartment in which her mother and Mr. Twistle were seated. There was an air of triumph in her eye when she entered, and her mother at once divined the cause. But she said nothing, and waited until Margaret spoke. "Ma," she said, "it is tea time, and the Colonel expects you upstairs, and if you had any friends, he hoped you would not deprive him of your company on that account, but bring them upstairs to tea. He is particularly good-humoured tonight." "Curse him!" involuntarily exclaimed the attorney, as he heard of the good humour the Colonel was in, and he had so much cause to be vexed himself. "Will you come with us, Mr. Twistle?" "I will, thank you, ma'am. I am very tired," said Twistle, as he thought it would afford him some opportunity of discovering something that would enable him to be revenged, and at the same time do a seeming service to the other party. "At all events," he muttered, "it will give me a chance of making a more intimate and useful acquaintance with him. I must do something or other, and I may as well make a good thing of it as well as a bad one. That wouldn't be bad policy." "Then you had better come up at once," said Margaret, "for the tea is waiting." Thus urged, Mrs. Meredith and Mr. Twistle followed Margaret, and walked up to the drawing-room where the Colonel was, as before, seated in an easy-chair, with the green shade still over one eye, and his arm carried in a sling, though he did not appear to have lost the entire use of it, and by his side was a stick, a valuable Malacca cane, with which he walked, and his lame foot was supported by an ottoman. "Well, sir," said the Colonel, "I have the extreme felicity of meeting you again. Be seated. It is a very charming day, the most comfortable that I recollect since I have returned to England." "It is remarkably fine," said the attorney, shrugging his shoulders, and giving a suspicious glance towards the Colonel, as if he thought there was a latent smile lurking upon the Colonel's countenance, but he could not detect it, and yet he felt very much aggravated. "There is, even in this climate," continued the Colonel, "some decent weather, but then, when matters go on happily and cheerfully, then the climate appears more genial and kind." "Strange that it should be so," said Mr. Twistle, "but I can't help thinking he looks more provoking than ever I saw in my life." As he muttered, the Colonel said, "What did you say, sir?" "I merely said that we, who are used to it, look upon it in some other light than that of a merely negative character. That is, we look upon some of it as positively good. Nay, we are apt to call it beautiful, especially when it continues fine." "Continues fine," said the Colonel. "Does it really continue fine in this climate?" "Why, one would think, Colonel, you have never been in this country before to hear you talk, and yet you are a native of this country." "Yes, I am. That is, I believe so, but I have spent so many years in Asia that I am more a native of India than this country. However, I believe what you say to be correct, but, you see, the slightest change of weather affects my wounds, when you could not believe any change that had taken place, or, at all events, the change would be so slight as to cause no difference to you, and yet, even before that comes, I feel the approaching change." "I dare say you do, sir, but it must be unpleasant in the extreme." "It certainly is, and I have found it so. Mrs. Meredith, I hope you enjoyed your walk. Did you go far?" "No, Colonel, I did not, else I had not been back so soon. By the way, how do you feel after your walk, or, rather, ride? I had not time to ask you before." "Oh, I am very well. I enjoyed it much, but I must take another the day after tomorrow," said the Colonel. "That is, another ride, for I cannot walk far." "Do you intend going far?" "To the South Sea House," replied the Colonel. "To the South Sea House," repeated the attorney to himself, as he sipped his tea. "He has some of the stock on his hands. Well, I dare say that is likely. People belonging to these companies generally prefer them to any other stock. However, I will follow him there, and see if I can't do better. I will tread upon his heels, but what I will find out something this time, at all events." "Are you acquainted with that stock?" he inquired, after a pause. "What, the South Sea stock?" inquired the Colonel. "Yes." "Not much, but I believe it to be good steady stock, a very good investment. It will pay you a better interest than the funds." "But is it as secure?" "Well, that is a very difficult thing to answer," said the Colonel, "but I think is safe enough. I have that opinion of it that I do not object to hold it." "That, of course, is the best answer one can have to its presumed security." "Yes, I have a good opinion of it, and do not object holding it, as I said before, and that is the best opinion that can well be offered. Have you any?" "None, sir, but I have a friend who wanted to purchase stock of some kind, or to place money out to advantage, and I wish to learn a little more concerning it." "I do not mean to say that there is no better, but when you have once invested your money, you do not like to change the stock." "Certainly not. It is unadvisable," said the attorney, "unless you have some specific reason for so doing at the best of times. You are the loser by the expenses." "Well," said Mrs. Meredith, "I am very glad to see you are so well after your journey." "Journey, do you call it? Why, ma'am, I cannot call anything less than some few hundred miles a journey. Anything less is a mere bagatelle." "Dear me, Colonel, what journeys you must have travelled." "Indeed I have, ma'am. Some of them beautiful and romantic, and some of them dreary, and some terrible from the obstacles that opposed us, and others from the nature of the ground that we had to go over, and the dangers attendant from fatigue, climate, and enemy. It must be a terrible thing. Females in those parts are out of the question." "Oh dear no, there are ladies, and English ladies too, who live there for years, and who follow their husbands, movements with the camp, and who undergo all the dangers and fatigues merrily and cheerfully, and even put some of the best of us to the blush for fortitude. Well, I am glad we have a good character, even so far off as India. It cannot but be expected the mothers of such men can bear fatigue and hardship, else their sons could never be what they are. However, we have many examples of heroism in India, not of men only, but women also." "Then there are many interesting points for us to hear explanation about India," said Margaret. "I love to hear such things, especially from those who have been there, and mixed up among the people who live there, and who have had much experience with them." "I hope we shall have ample time to talk over many such matters," returned the Colonel, "for to me it is pleasant to speak of the past, and relate all I have seen, known, and taken part in a place so distant from us all as our Eastern Empire." "Indeed, I love to hear them," said Margaret. "I am afraid she will keep you pretty constantly employed in relating all that you have ever seen, Colonel," said Mrs. Meredith. "She's a strange girl, and has many fancies that way. She's fond of the wild, irregular life that you describe. She would have made an excellent soldier's wife, I am sure. She's so fond of that kind of thing." "I hope she will do so now, madam, and that she will have less of the fatigue and danger that fall to the lot of a good many. For I candidly tell you, it is one thing to hear these things talked of, and another to bear with them. Plains of burning sand and want of water, mountainous regions covered with snow, and no means to obtain warmth and shelter. These are things exciting enough in a narrative, and yet heartbreaking to experience." "Oh," said the attorney, "there can be no doubt it's much better in perspective than it is to experience. I can easily imagine, when you hear of battles and sieges, how they wish they had been there, and how much would have been done by our individual exertions. But, dear me, that's as different from being shot in the evening, and so seeing none of the fun that was to follow. Lord bless my heart, being put out of the way in that manner positively makes me nervous, I do believe. I could be hanged before I marched up to the breach." "Fortunately, all men are not of that opinion, else we might all of us be murdered in our beds, and no one to protect us," said Margaret contemptuously. "It is necessary," said the Colonel, "that some men should be born for one purpose, and some another. Some are poltroons from their birth, and require better men to take care of them, while others win honour and profit on the field of death and danger, and snatch triumph from the hands of death." "Exactly," said the attorney. "Half a loaf is better than no bread, and half a man is better than no man at all. And I believe that many of them leave the field of battle, leave it in a very little better state. Now, I should not care for the life upon such terms. It must be such as is worth living for, and such I do not consider life when one is rendered a cripple all one's life." "Well," said the Colonel, "we all have our different ideas upon that subject, but I rather think the state would be nothing without the profession of arms, and the lawyers would grace the lamp-posts if I might judge from popular opinion." "Popular opinion is nothing in this country upon such matters," said Twistle contemptuously. "It amounts to something," retorted the Colonel, "and you would say so, I imagine, if you felt it clinging to your throat in the shape of a halter administered by the canaille." "Why," said Mrs. Meredith, "I dare say it isn't always expressed so forcibly, and Mr. Twistle does not hold it of any importance, so long as it is not expressed so loudly as that." "Certainly, Mrs. Meredith, that is my meaning, for an illegal act committed by a contemptible portion of the population becomes of importance." "So it does," said the Colonel. "That is easily verified." "But still, we may be thankful to those who bravely fight and die, that we may be here in ease and quiet, and free from danger, and able to enjoy our lives and homes in peace." "That is true," said the attorney. "The one part of a nation cannot do without another. All are necessary, and produce a powerful kingdom. And not only powerful, but rich and intelligent." "No doubt of that," said the Colonel. Tea was now cleared away, and some wine was placed upon the table, and the Colonel took a few glasses of some rare wine, of which he offered the attorney to drink, and the latter willingly accepted, and found it some of the best he had tasted. And he continued to taste it until he got quite talkative, and, to the pain and mortification of Mrs. Meredith, began to talk in a strain that would, in a short time, have done them much discredit and mischief. Mrs. Meredith, however, always full of expedient, soon devised one that had the effect of putting an end to a scene she feared would come to an unpleasant act, if continued in, and therefore left the room for a few minutes, and then when she returned she said, "Mr. Twistle, you have been sent for. You are wanted immediately." I? Sent for?" "Yes, sir, you are wanted." "Nobody knew I was here." "Oh, yes, I told my clerk as I came along, confound him. Just as I was so comfortable, too." "We can finish this another time," said the Colonel, pointing to the bottle. "Yes, thank you. Good night, Colonel Deverill." "Good night, Mr. Twistle." Mr. Twistle quitted the drawing-room, vowing vengeance to himself against the brute of a clerk of his, who should dare to come and interrupt such an agreeable evening. It was most horribly provoking. He could have called down the vengeance of the universe upon the head of the offending mortal who had come for him, and in this mood of mind he entered the parlour. "Where is he? Where is he?" "Where is who?" inquired Mrs. Meredith. "My clerk, the man who came for me." "Listen, Mr. Twistle," said Mrs. Meredith. "I have called you out. No one has been for you, but I had no other means of calling you out, as I wanted to speak to you." "Well," said Mr. Twistle, half surprised and half vexed, "what do you want to say to me now I am here?" "I want to impress upon you the fact that the habits of the Colonel lead him to retire about this time, and I feared you, not knowing this, might stop beyond the proper moment, and so took this method of telling you what I am sure you would like to know." Mr. Twistle could not object. There was something reasonable in it, and yet he was at heart vexed, and could not help saying, "I should have thought the Colonel would not have been so pleasant and so talkative. If he had not been comfortable, he would have said so." "Oh dear, no. He would not have done that, even if you had remained till daylight. He has too much courtesy towards a stranger to do so." "Very well," said Twistle, "I will be gone. However, I will take care and not forget the South Sea House the day after tomorrow. You must make the best of it you can, and let me know when he is likely to go, so that I may not lose any chance." "Certainly not. I'll do as I did before," said the lady. "Do so. And I hope you will meet with better luck than you met with before." "I hope so too," said the attorney gravely. "However, here I am, and I'll do all that I can do for you. Good-bye, Mrs. Meredith. Good day. Good night." "Good night," said Mrs. Meredith, and the attorney left the house, to their inexpressible relief, for he was growing very talkative and very troublesome too, for the misfortune was, he more than once touched upon forbidden topics. End of chapter 136. Read by Richard Wallace, Liberty, Missouri, February 10th, 2010. Chapter 137 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3 by Peckett PREST. Chapter 137. The difficulties to be encountered in the choice of a bridesmaid. "Well, Margaret," said Mrs. Meredith, when they were alone in their own apartment. "Well, and how have you got on with the Colonel?" "Oh, very well indeed, Ma." "I am glad of it. Has he proposed anything new to you, my dear? Or has he said anything more to you of a particular character? Has he said anything respecting property? That is what we want to know pretty well, and that is the only point that can be more than usually interesting to us." "No, Ma, nothing about property. I could not expect he would say anything to me, and I hardly expect he would say to any one at all. You see, he is no doubt a rich man." "Well, and he would not consider it at all necessary to say anything about it to anyone. That it is so peculiarly private, and has nothing to do with anyone, and he does not imagine that we require anything of the kind. I am sure if the thought entered his mind he would at once satisfy us upon the subject. I cannot speak to him about it, because, having none, I am really not entitled to do so. That's my opinion upon the subject, though Mr. Twistle, I dare say, has a different one to me. Indeed, he generally has one of his own. Yes, you may depend upon that, but I have been thinking the matter over, and I am sure he is what he says he is. But what did he say, my dear? Why, he insists that I shall name an early day. Insists, my child! What does he mean? Merely in a good-natured, though urgent manner. Indeed, he wishes me to make up my mind and have him at once. If I'll consent to have him, he'll obtain a special license to solemnize the marriage here in this house, or at church, which I like best. Which shall I consent to, Ma? Well, my dear, I think you may as well be married at home. It will be so much more fashionable than going to church. It will be much more trouble, and will hardly seem like a marriage, I think, if it is not done at a church. What do you think? It will make more noise, said Mrs. Meredith, if it is done at home, and yet nobody can say a word about it if it takes place at church. So I think, now. So I think. Well, what did you decide? I did not decide upon anything, said Margaret. I declined to do so upon the moment, but said I would think about it, and after a few words I promised I would let him know the next time he spoke to me about it, which should not be before tomorrow afternoon. Very well, my dear. A becoming reluctance will never hurt your cause. You have done quite right, and I have no doubt but he will feel more pleased with you than if you had at once consented upon his first asking. So I thought, Ma, said Margaret. But you must not carry that too far, or it may defeat its own object. When next he asks you, you must affect a great deal of emotion, trembling and blushing and all that kind of thing, which you can do very well, or if you should distrust yourself, you can practice it a bit before a glass. I did it when I was your age, and I did it well. Yes, Ma, I can manage all that well enough, but what time shall I name? Well, that must in some measure depend upon the humor you find him in. If he be very pressing, you may shorten the period. If he appear distant, lengthen it. But if there is any danger, take him at his word at once and have no delay. It will not do to lose a chance. He must not be allowed to get off in that manner, and you must declare your confusion to be so great that you hardly know what you say. But, as he is so very pressing, you will give in to his wishes, and you may name any day you like best, and then he is caught, you see. I understand that clearly, but what time would you, as a medium time, give, which I ought to lengthen or shorten as occasion may seem to require? Well, my dear, about a fortnight. Ah, that was on my own tongue too. Well, then I should not have done wrong in naming 3 weeks or a month, which I felt disposed to say at first. No, but you need not make it more than 3 weeks, unless you see any fitting occasion, or any necessity for so doing, said Mrs. Meredith. After an amiable council the mother and daughter held, having for its object the entanglement and speedy marrying of the unfortunate East Indian colonel, they both indulged in balmy sleep, and slept till morn. The colonel himself said no more about the object of the previous day's conversation. When the amiable mother left the daughter alone with the colonel, who appeared as if actuated by clockwork, when the hour of his forbearance had passed, he again spoke of the matter. Miss Meredith, he said, my impatience will, I hope, be excused, on the score that my love is ardent, and I have already waited as long as I promised. You know to what I allude. I am afraid I must say I do, Colonel Deverill, said Margaret. But will you not grant me more time to consider this matter over? Remember, it is a serious matter. Of that there is no doubt, said the colonel, but I do not feel the same doubts you do, for I only feel how much I can do for your happiness, and how willingly I will do it. Of that I can have no fear. Then why not consent at once? Consent to have the man who loves you, who dotes upon you, and who will do all that an ample fortune can enable him to do for your welfare, and your future prosperity and comfort. Consider all that. I have considered much. I don't know that I need consider more than my present happiness. The future will take care of itself at all events. We can do no more than to deserve to do well, and to succeed in all our undertakings, to deserve to be happy. And do more you cannot, and who is there that can do as much? We all endeavor to do so. I hope we do, though I am sure there are many who might do better. But to return to my hopes, when will you consent to become mine? Say the day on which I am to be made happy, and if you really love me, make it as short as you can. Margaret appeared to hesitate, and hung her head, trembled, and the blushes mounted her cheek. The Colonel caught her in his arms, and pressing her to his bosom, he said, "Come, come, my own Margaret, say when shall I be made happy?" "Oh, Deverill," she sighed as she hid her face, "what shall I say? You are so urgent. Shall I say a fortnight, and yet that is too soon. No, no, not at all, not at all. Thank you, dear Margaret, thank you. I fear I have said too much. Forgive me." "Nay, nay, no more about it. I will be content. Tomorrow I will go to the city, and then I will purchase the wedding ring. I will obtain a license, and then we shall be ready against any contingencies. And on our wedding morning I will have some jewels ready for you. I have given them some orders, but they take a long while in getting ready." "Oh, you are too good." "Not a bit. Only just," said the Colonel, and he appeared as though he were quite satisfied with his conquest, and looked very well pleased with the success he had met with in the prosecution of his suit. It was a settled thing now, and he was, or professed to be, in ecstasies. "Mother," said Margaret as she entered the room, "it is all settled at last. I have given my consent, and the day is named." "Indeed! I am glad of it. When will the day arrive? What day is it?" "This day fortnight." "This day fortnight! Well, well, that will be a very good time indeed. We shall have a very busy time of it, for we must make the most of our arrangements between this and then, for we must get you in a fit out. But if you have a dress to appear in, that is as much as I shall be able to afford, for my means are so short." "I know all that, but he has promised me jewels, which he has ordered, but which will take some time in making. But he expects them to be ready by our wedding day. Come now, this seems to me to be a very handsome provision." "Very, my dear, very fortunate too, because you see the furniture was becoming somewhat less new and fine than it was. That would have compelled me to lessen my terms, so we should have gone gradually back, and perhaps been obliged to seek some other mode of living." "But you have some money by you?" "That was reserved in case of extreme misfortunes, and I cannot realize that immediately. However, it would only put off the evil day. But we are saved that now. We have caught a rare good fish. We have only to land him, that is, get some little to be done before we can pull him ashore. We must keep up the farce, but I tell you, we must not be guided by Mr. Twistle, though he is of great use." "No, Ma, we must not. I have thought on that. And yet I do not like to give up the idea of finding out first what he may have in the shape of property, though I am sure it would do no good. Yet to have one's curiosity satisfied is something gained. Still, I am not so curious that I must be satisfied at the expense of our prospects. No, Ma, I am sure I want badly enough to know all about it, but I will restrain my curiosity until I find out by means and at a time when no offense can be taken, or, if it be, why it's of no consequence, and I don't care anything about it, because I shall have a right to speak for myself." "Certainly, my dear, that is a very proper spirit indeed. But then he won't interfere with you much, except it is to want you to always be at his elbow." "Ah, I won't mind that, because you see, he may make a will, but I'll take pretty good care that nobody comes in between him and me." "Exactly. You have no relatives on his side to tease you, or give you any trouble. Therefore you have all plain sailing before you." "I have, and now, I suppose, it will not be too much to speak to one's bridesmaids?" "Ah, my dear," said Mrs. Merideth, with a shake of the head. "What's the matter, Ma?" "Ah, my dear, there is the difficulty. You know how easy the Colonel has fallen in love with you, how sudden that has all come about, and how short a time the courtship has continued." "So much the better, Ma." "Certainly, my love, but it should make you cautious, very cautious how you act with bridesmaids, because you don't know what may happen with such old people as the Colonel. They are dreadful, sometimes, and you don't know what they will do. They will fall in love with anybody. It is quite shocking to think of it. But it don't so much matter, only you see he may take a violent fancy to someone, and then you may lose by the whole affair. How so, Ma? Why, suppose he takes a fancy to one of the bridesmaids. You don't know what may pass between them. Certainly not. Very well, then he may make a will to reward her, as he would call it, and then you would lose so much, which is clear robbery, as I call it. So it would be, Ma, and yet, after all said and done, I cannot tell what else we are to do. Some female friends we must have, and the only precaution we can take will be to get someone as ugly as I can, and then keep her away as much as possible. The latter is the only effectual method, for ugliness is not always a safeguard. For men have got such tastes, and what we think extremely plain, they, by a perversity of taste, will persist in believing to be interesting, at least, if not pretty. I have known so many instances. Besides, I do know that even ugliness itself is no safeguard. Indeed, Ma? No, I had an instance of that. I may say two, even with your father, who took a fancy to two of the servants, one after the other. I am sure there was nothing in the hussies to attract any attention, but then, men will be men, and you can't help it. We must get rid of them. Yes, that is all you can do, but whom did you think of having? There are the two Miss Stewards. They are called pretty. I heard a gentleman say so at the last party we went to. So that, I think, decidedly bad policy. I know the men's taste very well, my dear, but it is different to what we call taste. I don't know why, but it is so. Well, Ma, if the Mrs. Stewart won't do, what do you say to the Mrs. Brown? They are anything but even passable. Besides, they are pitted with the smallpox, and very light hair, almost carroty. They are anything but fascinating. That may be all very true, my dear, but you know the Mrs. Brown sing. They are called good figures, and dashing young women, and they are very bold, which might tempt many people, especially when they are looking about for sweethearts. Yes, that is very true. Then there are the Mrs. Smith. They are very young, much too young to be at all likely to cause men to have any fancy for them. There, my dear innocent girl, you are entirely wrong, most entirely wrong. Indeed, Ma? Yes, my dear, you are innocence itself, because you have been brought up at home. But look here, men are the nastiest creatures alive. Why, some of them would fall in love with a girl 16 or 17 years old. Aye, more than that, I have seen some of them married at that age. Oh, I am shocked, said Margaret, as she lifted up her hands in amazement at this description of the vices of men. Ah, well, they may say at church, and there is no good in us. Indeed, my dear, you are quite right, and so is the prayer book. But it is as I tell you. Besides, men never forget these things. They will remember faces they have seen for a year or two, and then they will begin their games. Dear me, Ma, what shall I do? That is the difficulty, my dear. I would not have unfolded this book of vice before you, had it not been necessary for your happiness. Oh, fiddle-dee-dee, Ma, it's the money that I care for, it ain't the Colonel, poor old cripple. He may do as he pleases, as long as I get the gold. Well, my dear, said the careful mother, who felt the sedative effects of this speech. Well, my dear, but you know they do waste their means in these affairs, and that most outrageously sometimes, to cause a ruinous effect upon their home. Oh, but he's too much of an invalid. Do you know, Margaret, I think the Colonel is more of an invalid from habit than reality. Sometimes, when nobody's looking, he can walk and use both feet alike, and even use his left hand without any trouble at all. Do you really think so? Yes, but I don't mean to say it is all sham. Oh dear no, but long habit and the laziness of these rich Indians is so great that there is no knowing its extent. I don't believe they would eat if it wasn't for their being hungry. What is to be done? I will tell you, my dear. have Miss Twistle and her friend. Miss Twistle and Martha Briggs? Exclaimed Miss Meredith with a giggle. What a fright! So much the better, my dear, so much the better. It is just what you want, the very thing above all others. Have a fool and a fright, and you can drop their acquaintance whenever you like, and I think there can be no danger of the Colonel's falling in love with them, at least, added Mrs. Meredith, with emphasis, at least upon such an occasion. Very well, Ma, let it be Miss Twistle and Martha Briggs. Goodness me, how I shall be attended upon this occasion. It will be quite laughable. I mustn't let the Colonel see them before the morning arrives, else he will be sure to laugh at them. Ha ha ha, laughed both mother and daughter at the idea of the two frights, as they called them, being bridesmaids, and in high good humor they both retired to rest for the night, to dream of the forthcoming occasion. End of chapter 137 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. Read by Richard Wallace. Liberty, Missouri, 13 February 2010.
Chapter 138 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carolyn Power. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST. Chapter 138. Mr. Twistle's misfortunes, and his resolution never to give in. The next day, after that on which the conversation respecting the choice of a bridesmaid took place, was the day on which the Colonel was to visit the South Sea house. Early that morning he ordered a coach to be in attendance, and left the house, saying that he would be back in time for tea, that he had to make several purchases, and transact some necessary business that would occupy him until that time. He kissed Margaret, and whispered in her ear that he should call and see about the jewels, and urge the jeweller to get them ready. These people are so dilatory, he said, that, unless I worry them, they will disappoint me of them, and I would not be without them on the occasion of our marriage for a trifle. We must not set our happiness upon such things, said Margaret. Ah, what self-denial you can exert, said the Colonel playfully. No, my happiness is not fixed upon such objects as those, and therefore it is no trouble to renounce them when it is necessary to do so. I hope there will be no need. I believe there will be none, but good-bye till tea-time, then we shall pass a pleasant evening together. The Colonel left the house, and no sooner had he done so than Mrs. Meredith wrote a short note to Mr. Twistle, informing him of the Colonel's departure at a much earlier hour than she had anticipated. "Here, Mary," she said to the drudge. "Yes, Mum," replied the domestic. "Just run as fast as you can to Mr. Twistle with this note, and don't let the grass grow under your feet. Do you hear?" "Yes, Mum." Away went the drudge as fast as she could to the man of law, and arrived there out of breath, and having gone there fast, according to orders, she thought herself at liberty to take her own time in going back, which she performed to perfection. Mr. Twistle cursed himself for this unexpected departure, but there was no time for deliberation. He crushed on his hat, took a coach, and drove as hard as the mysteriously kept-up cattle could carry it, and was fortunate enough to see the Colonel go by in another. He jumped out, paid the jarvey, and then made a rush after the Colonel, whom he saw going up the steps. Determined that he would not be outdone this time, he rushed through a crowd of men who were near at hand, and jostled them so that they gave him more oaths than was consistent with courtesy, and one of them desired to know if he were running after himself or anybody else. Heedless of this, he pushed on, and trod upon a bricklayer's foot so hard that the man gave a great shout, and, by way of retaliation, brought his heavy hand down so hard upon the attorney's hat that the article of wearing apparel was forced below his chin, much to the detriment of his vision, which was totally eclipsed. In an instant he was struggling with his hat, and yet was unable to release himself from the durance in which his head was held. But he found this was not all he had to contend with, for he felt himself pushed and hustled about in a strange manner, till he was thrown on a doorstep, and then he was suddenly left to himself, with no soul near him. "Upon my word, this must be done on purpose, I do verily believe," said Mr. Twistle, as he at length succeeded in wrenching his hat off his head after many violent efforts, but even then it was at the expense of the lining and skin of his nose, which was a very disagreeable affair after all. Mr. Twistle, for a moment or two, stared round him, and wondered where he was, until, at length, upon some examination, he found himself round the corner. "Oh, I must have got hustled round the corner. Yes, I see how it is. It's a downright conspiracy of theirs. There can't be two minds." But then again, he thought, what conspiracy could there be necessary to marry a girl without money? If she had money, he could have understood it, but not as the matter stood. That was quite impossible. It was an impenetrable mystery. As these thoughts passed through his mind, he was sitting on the step of a door, and, seeing the blood trickle off his nose in vermilion drops upon the pavement, he felt for his handkerchief to wipe the injured feature and stop the bleeding. But alas, it was not in this pocket, nor in that. It was not in his hat. He never carried it there. If he had, his head would never have reached the crown of his hat. That was quite certain. It would have been better had he done so. But, as it was not about him, where could it be? He knew that he had had it before he left home on this errand. The truth, however, was not long before it came across his mind like a flash of light. He had got among a gang of London thieves, who had hustled and robbed him of his handkerchief. This was suggestive of other matters, and he, in consequence, put his hand to his watch fob, but also that was gone too. He gasped, felt his breeches pocket, and then he sank back, for he found his garments had been slit open by some sharp instrument, and his purse had fled. "Damn," said the attorney in a fury, but this subsided in a moment. The loss he had felt, and the pushing about he had experienced, was too much. He felt weakened and disheartened, and paused to think upon what he should do, and which way he should go. "It's no use giving in," he muttered, "no use at all. I must go on. And yet I had better go and see if the coach is gone, for if it is still there, and it can't have got away yet, I'll yet go in and see if I can find him." He walked round the corner, much shaken with what he had received in the way of knocks and kicks, but when he did get round, he saw the coach was gone. There was, however, a ticket porter at hand, and he determined to go and ask him a few questions. "My friend," he said, feeling in his pocket, "do you know a Colonel Devereux?" "No," said the man, "never heard of him. Where does he live?" "He came in here just now." "Oh, did he?" replied the man, kicking a piece of orange peel off the pavement. "I don't know him. Do you recollect a hackney coach coming up to the door just now with a lame gentleman who got out?" "Yes, with a green shade over his eye." "Yes, that was the man." "Oh, well, I never seed him before. I don't know him. He didn't stop a minute." "Oh," said Mr. Twistle. Then he turned away and walked towards his own house. However, he felt in his pocket for some money. A small sum in silver was loose in his pockets, and this he had saved, and he determined to treat himself to some brandy and water, for he was really much knocked about and terrified and nervous. So he went into the first public house he came to. This was a low house, the parlour of which was situated a long way back, and he walked in and threw himself into a seat. Well, here I am. This is disaster the second. Well, who would have believed I should have met with such misadventures as those I have just gone through? There's a fate in it. I'm sure this is an unlucky business altogether. Of that I am certain. I got into the watch-house on the first occasion, but now I am worse than that. I have been knocked about and robbed of money and goods. £15 in my purse. Confound Colonel Devereux, I say." "What will you take, sir?" "Eh?" inquired the bewildered attorney, who forgot that he had entered a public-house, and the waiter was desiring to know what he wished to have. "What will you like to take, sir?" inquired the waiter again. "A glass of brandy and water, and a biscuit." The man left the room, and Twistle retired within himself to contemplate the evils he had suffered, and those he was likely to endure. "Well, I never thought I was in such a thing as this. Who would ever have believed it? None, I am sure. No one would. Confound them! I'll give it up as a bad job, and a bad job it has been for me. I am quite confident of that." "Brandy and water and a biscuit," said the waiter, laying down the articles enumerated, and Twistle gave the necessary cash, accompanied by the customary gratuity, which ranges from 10 to 25% upon the money paid for the articles purchased. We have often thought this a most exorbitant tax upon those who require accommodation. If people cannot pay their own servants, they ought not to keep them. To be sure, you are told you need not pay anything. It is entirely voluntary, and that they do not wish it. But you only obtain a flippant answer, so as to attract everyone's eyes in the place, and the end of it is, if there is much business, you don't get any attention at all. "Well, I won't give in," said Mr. Twistle, with a thump on the table, but he had drank nearly 2/3 of the brandy and water. "No, I won't give in." He swallowed down the remainder, finished the biscuit, and leaned back in his seat, and then he began to talk to himself. "I will not give in. After all that has passed, it would be a shame to be done, robbed, beaten, and kicked, and then give in. Nonsense! I will go through the whole affair, and that shall repay me in the end. I'll lay it on the thicker for this." This was a comfortable resolution on the part of Mr. Twistle, and which appeared to please him well, for he smiled quietly, and then rose much refreshed and left the house. This last allusion of Twistle's was consolatory, and had an intimate connection with certain imaginary charges he would make to the Devereux family when he got the business. But as that was a matter buried in the womb of futurity, we will not follow him in his speculations. "I won't give in," he said, as he walked on and thrust his hand into the slit that had been cut in his trousers to extract his purse, but this only confirmed him in his resolution, and he uttered again and again, "I won't give in." "I won't give in," he murmured, as he sought the knocker of Mrs. Meredith's door. "I won't give in. I'm not a man whose resolution is easily shaken. Oh dear, no. I'll tell my good friend Mrs. Meredith all my troubles, and then ask her what she thinks of me, if I ain't an indefatigable friend, one who will never sink under difficulties." End of Chapter 138 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3.
Chapter 139 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST. Chapter 139. Mrs. Meredith has a conversation with Mr. Twistle. The announcement and the invitation. When the servant answered the knock, Mr. Twistle learned, to his severe disappointment, that Mrs. Meredith was from home, and he was about to turn from the door, after leaving his name, when the girl said that her mistress had left a message, the purport of which was, that if he, Mr. Twistle, was to call, she would feel obliged by his awaiting her return, as her absence would be but short, and the subject upon which she wished to see him was one of particular importance. Mr. Twistle was shown into the parlour much about the same as usual, but he himself was somewhat of a different state. He himself was considerably disgusted with his share of the business, but, as we have before stated, he was resolved never to give in. No, he was resolved to carry it on to the end. It must come to a wind-up somehow or other, and at some time or other, but, at the same time, as I have taken so much interest in that I am resolved to see it out, I won't lose all I have lost for nothing. It shall be with me a neck or nothing affair. And however aggravating it may be, you will have a greater chance in the long run of coming off victorious. Several minutes passed away, and still Mrs. Meredith came not. At length the attorney began to grow somewhat impatient, and he looked around the apartment, as if to find some object to pass away the time until her arrival. On a table in the centre of the room lay several books, and he opened one or two of them for the purpose of ascertaining the nature of the contents. The title of one of them attracted his attention. It consisted of a collection of tales of the supernatural, and he opened it upon a legend called "The Dead Not Dead." It possessed considerable interest, and Twistle was soon lost in its details. It ran as follows. The moon, with her train of glittering satellites following with silent grandeur in her wake, is sailing in lustrous glory through the heavens, and shedding such a flood of light over the face of nature, that the mountains and trees look as if some mighty hand had tinted them with silver. Our scene is a rocky pass amidst the stupendous Apennines, one of the wildest and yet most beautiful of that romantic region. At the foot of a tree, and on a spot on which the rays of the moon fall with all their power, sits a young man, who is evidently watching over what appears to be a dead body that lies prostrate at his feet. His head is resting on his hand, and he is regarding the form before him with mingled fear and determination. Hark! He speaks! What are his words? For full an hour have the rays of yonder luminary poured their radiance upon the ghastly features of my dead master, and yet there is no visible effect. Surely he must have been laboring under some fearful delusion of mind, and the dreadful compact of which he has spoken had existence but in his imagination. I certainly had some little faith in the existence of those scourges to mankind, vampires, but now I am inclined to think my faith will be terribly shaken. In God's name, I hope it may. The moon rose higher and higher, until, as she reached her zenith, everything was so bathed in her gentle light that scarcely a shadow was thrown around, save by the tall pines that were scattered here and there upon the face of the rocks. Suddenly there was a movement in the form of the dead man, a spasmodic jerk of the whole muscles of the frame, as if a galvanic battery had been applied to it, and then the eyes slowly opened, though at first there was but little or no expression in them. The young man started to his feet with an exclamation of horror, and stood glaring upon the form with fixed and protruding eyes, his limbs trembling, and every feature distorted with mental agony. "Holy Mother of God!" he murmured in a low tone. "He moves! He moves! The terrible compact is too true!" At this moment, though there was not the slightest appearance of a cloud in the whole heavens, mutterings of thunder were heard, and the lightning was seen playing around the treetops with a pale and sickly glare. The young man, so intensely was his attention fixed upon the corpse at the foot of the tree, did not notice this phenomena, and he was at length horrified at beholding a ball of blue fire dart from the air and glide into the ground immediately at the head of him whom he had named as his master. Then there was a loud explosion and a glare of light so broad and strong that the watcher of the dead was obliged to veil his eyes with his hands, and he could scarcely tell for some moments whether he was deprived of his sight or not. When he opened his eyes again, it was with a start of surprise, for before him, with his arms folded on his breast, and regarding him with a calm and untroubled countenance, stood his master, while the moonlight streamed out upon the landscape, and as great a silence as when he lay in death upon the ground reigned around. "Oh, Signor," he at length stammered in broken tones, "my vigil has been one of the most terrible—" "Silence, Spalatro," said the resuscitated one in a deep and hollow voice. "Silence! Not a word, now or henceforth, must pass your lips respecting what you have seen tonight. Breathe but a syllable of what I am to a human being, and naught on earth shall hide you from my vengeance." Spalatro bowed before his master in obedience, while his frame gave a shudder of horror as he regarded the deathly appearance that still lingered in the signor's features. "Spalatro," resumed the signor after a slight pause, "you have rendered me great and faithful service, and your reward has been proportionate. But there is yet another service which I would seek at your hands. The Lady Oriana, for the possession of whom the Signor Francati and I have fought, and for whose sake I received the wound which deprived me for a time of life, is at Florence, and at present ignorant of the mishap that befell me. The Signor Francati and yourself are the only persons who are aware of it. He will carry to Florence the news of my death, and, on my reappearance before the Lady Oriana, what tale can I invent to satisfy her? No, no, he must not reach Florence. He must never look upon the Lady Oriana again. You, Spalatro, wear a poniard. You have a powerful hand, and you know well where to strike. Rid me of this hated rival, and wealth shall be yours." Spalatro stood rooted to the spot while the signor spoke, and an expression of mingled horror and disgust crossed his countenance as the latter proceeded. When the signor had concluded, he stepped a pace or two back, and in a tone full of indignation said, "Signor Waldberg, I am no assassin. My poniard is yet guiltless of shedding human blood. I saw you receive what was thought to be a mortal wound in honorable combat with the Signor Francati, and in these arms I beheld you sink in death. You had extorted from me a promise that after a certain lapse of time I would convey your body to this vast solitude, and lay it where the moonbeams should fall upon it, for that then life should once more revisit you. All this I have done, and faithfully. I feared to fail in my promise, for I knew the penalty you would pay if you failed to fulfill the conditions of your compact. But, Signor, I am now no longer bound to you. You have commenced a fresh existence, which you would baptize with blood. You have passed the portals of death, and I will no longer serve you. I will seek another service and another master, who will require less at my hands, though his pay may be lighter. Farewell, Signor, and better thoughts to you. Spalatro turned upon his heel as he spoke, and with a hasty wave of his hand was leaving the spot, when the Signor drew a pistol from a belt that was fastened round his waist, and exclaiming, "He knows too much respecting me to be suffered to live," fired it full at the head of the young man. The latter uttered a yell of agony which echoed loudly amid the awful silence, and fell lifeless on the earth. When the smoke from the pistol had cleared away, that lonely spot was deserted save by the body of Spalatro, whose blood, streaming upon the ground, reflected the moonbeams with a dull red glare. When the morning sun broke over the mountain tops, its rays fell upon the form of the still insensible Spalatro. It was but seldom that any footsteps, save those of the wolf or the goat, left their impress on those rocks, and it was almost a miracle that the body of the unfortunate man was not left a prey to the former. About an hour after daybreak, the bells of a string of mules were heard in the distance, accompanied by the cheerful song of the muleteer. A short time sufficed to bring the cavalcade to the spot where lay the body of Spalatro, and the muleteer, with a cry of alarm, brought his train to a stop. Finding that life still remained, the humane mountaineer raised him from the ground, placed him across one of the mules, and then hastened forward to the next inn, which, however, was at some miles' distance. On arriving there, he found that the only apartment was occupied by a signor and his daughter, who, however, when the condition of the wounded man was made known to them, instantly relinquished it to him, and, after seeing his wounds looked to, ascertained that no mortal result was to be feared, and giving orders that he should want for no attention that money could procure, they pursued their journey. It was many weeks before Spalatro recovered, and when he did regain his strength, he learned, with a feeling of deep gratitude, that the lady who had been so instrumental in his recovery was no other than the Signora Oriana. In an instant a vow was upon his lips that he would save her from the power of the fearful monster whose only mission now on earth seemed but to destroy the most beautiful of nature's creation. With this purpose fixed in his mind, he one morning bid adieu to the residents of the little inn, and set off on his self-imposed errand. Some days after the scene we have described as occurring on that lonely mountain pass, a report reached Florence, where the Signora Oriana was then staying with her father, that the Signor Fracatti had met his death at the hands of a bravo, and that his body had been discovered stabbed in innumerable places. The grief of Oriana was intense, for she held the Signor in great estimation, and she would have had but little hesitation in bestowing upon him her hand, if her father's consent could but have been gained to the union. Signor Vivaldi, however, had been captivated by the great wealth, personal appearance, and captivating manners of the Signor Waldeburg, and he had fixed his mind upon him becoming the husband of his daughter. Weeks passed away, and the memory of the murdered Fracatti was gradually fading from the mind of Oriana. The respectful yet warm attention of Waldeburg won upon a young and innocent heart that had always felt a slight esteem for him. And as she knew that her father's happiness in a great measure depended upon her consent to the union, it was at length given with a freedom that brought joy to the old man's heart. It was arranged that the ceremony should take place at a chateau belonging to Waldeburg, in the neighborhood of Lucca, whither it was resolved at once to proceed, and for this purpose Signor Vivaldi and his daughter, accompanied by Waldeburg, left Florence for that city. As they were passing through the gates, a monk, with his cowl drawing carefully over his face, stepped hastily up to the carriage window, and, thrusting a letter into the hands of Oriana, as hastily disappeared. With some surprise she opened it and read it, and then a paleness overspread her countenance, and she sank back in her seat, almost insensible. Her father snatched the paper from her trembling hand, and hastily glancing over its contents, with a look of anger handed it to the Signor Waldeburg. "See, Signor, what some meddling fool, envious of your happiness, has done to alarm my daughter's fears. Does he deem us so grossly superstitious as to believe in such children's tales?" The signor took the paper, which he found to run thus: "Signora, a grateful heart warns you, wed not the murderer of Fracatti, wed not him who, once returned from death to life, seeks but your hand to provide a victim for the purpose of prolonging a hateful existence. If you despise this warning, at any rate postpone the ceremony but for 7 days from hence, and then his power of injuring you will have departed from him." "Do you know the writer, signor?" asked Vivaldi. "It is evidently the handwriting of a servant of mine, whom I dismissed for insolence some few weeks since," returned Waldberg, a shade of vexation evidently passing across his brow. "And he now takes this means of endeavoring to obtain his revenge, but I will take means of having him punished." They now endeavored to soothe the agitation of Oriana, but the incident seemed to have taken a firm hold upon her imagination, and in spite of all their efforts she found it impossible to shake off the effect it had upon her. The chateau, the place of their destination, was at length reached. Preparations were instantly commenced for the celebration of the marriage, which was to take place, by the Signor Waldberg's express desire, on the 6th day from that on which they had left Florence. As the day drew near, the spirits of Oriana grew gradually depressed, and a slight feeling of dread seemed to steal over her whenever she found herself in the presence of her lover. Her father questioned her as to its cause, and then she confessed that the mysterious warning she had received preyed deeply on her mind. It might be a superstitious weakness, but she could not repress it, and she requested her father, however reluctant he might be, to consent to put it off for at least another day. The entreaties of his daughter, though he laughed at her fears, prevailed upon the old man, and he gave his consent to her request. But when he mentioned the alteration in time to Waldberg, the countenance of the latter underwent a complete change to the hue of death. No prayer, however, could prevail upon the old man to recall his consent to his daughter's wish, and the signor departed evidently in a state of the greatest despair. That night the Signora Oriana was missing from her chamber, and though the strictest search was made for her, not the least trace of her presence could be found. The grief of the father and the lover knew no bounds, and there seemed to be no hope of consolation for them. It is the night of the 6th day, that day against which Oriana had been so mysteriously warned. In a large vault, far beneath the chateau, and lighted by innumerable torches, that threw a red and smoky glare around, stood the beautiful Oriana and the Signor Waldberg. The former was pale as marble, and an expression of the most intense despair was upon her countenance. The signor, resolved that she should become his wife before the expiration of the 6 days, had torn her from her chamber, and immured her in that fearful place, with the hope of forcing her to become his bride. But Oriana revolted at such usage, and feeling more convinced than ever that the warning she had received had its foundation in truth, had resisted alike his persuasions and his threats. The hour of midnight was fast approaching, and before an altar that stood at one end of the vault was an old and venerable priest with an open book in his hand. Waldberg drew Oriana towards him, and forced her to kneel at the foot of the altar. She entreated, she supplicated, she appealed to the priest. His only answer was a solemn shake of the head, and then he proceeded to read the marriage ceremony. Waldberg took her hand, but she suddenly flung it from her and uttered the most piercing screams that echoed fearfully amidst those cavernous places. Still the priest read on, and despite her emotion and her agony of terror, Waldberg regarded her with a cold and determined gaze. "Faster, faster," he muttered to the priest, "or all will be lost," and he glanced anxiously around the vault. At the moment, striking fearfully on the silence, came the sound of the turret clock telling the hour of midnight. On the first stroke, the most fearful sounds the human ear ever listened to filled the place. Strange, indefinite shadows flitted around, filling the air with a rushing sound as if of mighty wings. The altar changed to a heap of human bones, the priest to a ghastly skeleton. Then came darkness, terrible and distinct, and Oriana swooned upon the damp floor. When she recovered, she found the day had broken, and the sunlight was streaming upon her face, while her father and the young man whom she had seen wounded at the inn in the mountains were stooping over her in alarm. The inhabitants of the chateau had been alarmed in the dead of the night by a terrific storm, which had thrown into ruins a part of the castle, and a vast chasm had been made in the foundations, disclosing the vaults, the existence of which had been until then unknown. Beneath the rich vestments of Waldberg, and lying in a heap on the ground, were the remains of a human skeleton, all that was now left of the guilty being who had thus paid the penalty for failing in complying with the conditions of the fearful compact into which he had entered with the unholy powers of darkness. It was many months before the mind of Oriana recovered its strength, and when it did, she entered a convent of Ursuline nuns, and endeavored to forget, in the consolations of religion, the fearful trial she had undergone. Twistle laid down the book which he had been reading, and fell into a strange kind of musing, in which the vampire, Waldberg, and the East India colonel were strangely mixed up together. From his reverie he was awakened by a rap at the street door, and then, in a few minutes afterwards, Mrs. Merideth entered the room, exclaiming, "Well, Mr. Twistle, you always come in luck's way." "Indeed," said Mr. Twistle, involuntarily thinking of what he had that morning undergone, as well as what he went through a day or two before, and for the life of him he saw not what might be called luck, unless it was that species known as ill luck. "Yes, Mr. Twistle, you are. You've just come in time to hear the news." "What news, ma'am? What news? If you'll be pleased to enlighten me upon that subject, I shall be better able to understand what you allude to." "Why, you see, the colonel has been so pressing that my daughter has been induced to name the day. Yes, Mr. Twistle, she has named the day, not a distant day either. He begged and entreated you don't know how hard, which, at least, shows how much he meant it." "Well, truly it is news, Mrs. Merideth," said the attorney, "but at the same time it is just what I expected, though not just at this juncture. The fact is, there is but little can be said against Colonel Deverill, but at the same time there will be but little said for him. I am by no means sure that there will be any property found. If he were a man of money, he would not hesitate to lay his circumstances open." "He is too proud for that." "Well, it may be all very well to attribute it to that cause. However that may be, there can be no doubt you have a right to do as you please, and I bow to your decision. But still I do so, having expressed my opinion to the contrary, being very suspicious of him. But, as I said before, you are entitled to do what you please in the affair. I have no right to do more." "My daughter and I have been considering the matter over and over again, and we have come to the conclusion that it should take place, and she has consented that it should take place in about 10 days' time, when we shall expect to have your company, Mr. Twistle. I am obliged to you, and assure you my opinions upon this matter are not at all personal. I will meet the colonel, and I will be present with you all on that happy occasion with much pleasure, and I hope it will be a fortunate and happy marriage." "I hope so too," said Mrs. Merideth, "and I have every reason to believe so." "That is good," said the attorney. "And now, Mr. Twistle," said Mrs. Merideth, "what did you do this morning at the South Sea House? I could not send to you as early as I could have wished, as I did not know he was going till the coach was ordered, and he went away almost immediately. I then sent Mary to you. I don't know at what time she came to you, but at all events she was not back here until late." "She must have got to my place in good time, if she only started after the colonel had left this house," said the attorney. "I am very glad of that, at all events, but what success did you have?" "Success indeed," said Mr. Twistle with a shrug of mortification. "I have only succeeded in getting myself into a very serious difficulty, and the colonel has eluded me again. I can't understand it all. I don't know what to think, but I am sure of this, that I have been in a series of disasters ever since I undertook to follow him about, and I have discovered nothing concerning him." "What has happened to you today, then?" inquired Mrs. Merideth. "Oh, as for that, what seems to be but natural in itself, and therefore it may be said not to be connected with him. Indeed, though that were really the case, yet there is so much concurrent action, I cannot divest myself of the idea that it is a fatal affair as far as regards looking after him." "Then don't do so any more, Mr. Twistle." "I'll never give in," said Twistle. "Well, but what need you trouble yourself more about the affair? I assure you we're all well satisfied that Colonel Deverill is Colonel Deverill, and that he had property. That being the case, I am sure you have nothing to trouble yourself about, or to blame yourself for." "I am conscious of that," said the attorney, rubbing his knee. "I have done all I can, and I have given my advice. I hope I have done my part." "Yes, you have," said Mrs. Merideth. "I am quite satisfied. But what has happened to you?" I will tell you, my dear madam, I will tell you. I have been assaulted, knocked about, robbed, and my faculties all confused, and no use to me. I have lost my handkerchief, watch, and purse, and I have had my trousers ripped open, and I can't tell what besides. I am safe, however. Well, that is right at all events, but it is most annoying to me that you should be subject to these terrible accidents. I can't understand the meaning of it. I can't, said the attorney. But why should you, more than anyone else, be subject to these misfortunes? I can't understand it at all, Mr. Twistle. Perhaps you do something or other unusual on such occasions, which had been the cause of such terrible trouble. Not that I am aware of, said Twistle. But the fact is, I don't know of anything peculiar in my appearance or behavior that should cause this disaster. But I am sure of this, that there is nothing more singular about me than what there usually is, and why it should only attract notice on these occasions and no other, I cannot tell. Nor I. Well, I suppose it must have been there was some other circumstance, independent alike of him and you, that had caused this disagreeable affair. Perhaps there might be. Well now, Mr. Twistle, there's another affair I wish to speak to you about, or rather, it's a thing my daughter Margaret should speak to your daughter Elizabeth and Miss Martha about. You see, as they are not very often together, I thought it right to speak to you first. Yes, ma'am, go on, pray. Well, my Margaret is to be married in a few days. Now, we don't want relatives at all, and I was advising her to beg your permission to have the two young ladies whom I have named as bridesmaids, and who will be of essential service to my daughter. I have no doubt but they will feel very much gratified with the proposal, and one could not have been better devised than this one to please them. Then will you invite them to come here and spend the evening with Margaret and yourself, Mr. Twistle, the first evening you find leisure and inclination? Well, I have destroyed today so far as a business day by drinking brandy and water early, and I may as well finish it in an agreeable manner. That is very good. We shall expect you to tea this evening. You may, said Twistle, if you are not otherwise engaged. I may as well do all that is necessary so as to have as little to do by and by as possible. Has the Colonel come home? No, not yet. I did not expect him to come home so soon as this, but he will be back in a very short time now, I dare say. Then I will bid you good-bye, for it will be unnecessary to meet him in this plight. Indeed, he might think I paid him no respect to do so, and besides, it will be better, altogether, that he should not see me so soon, lest he should have caught sight of me in the city, which indeed I think wholly impossible, for I only had a distant glimpse of him. Then good-bye, sir. I shall see you and the young ladies, both my daughter and her friend Martha. Mr. Twistle arose and left the house to return to his own house and get his daughter prepared for the visit, and her friend also, while Mrs. Merideth and her daughter Margaret consulted together as to what would be the best method of doing honor to the occasion of the forthcoming marriage. You see, my dear, said Mrs. Merideth, we cannot very well invite our own friends, because they are such a greedy, rapacious set. They would sooner spoil a good chance for us than let us have it unmolested. They are by far too greedy. No, no, they must not come. They will think themselves injured if they cannot share the harvest. And all will be lost. To be sure, and moreover, we could not shake them off when we wanted, and which we must do very soon, for the Colonel will never abide them. No, Ma, I think not indeed. They are decidedly low people, who are genteel only of a Sunday. It will never do to have such people about us. Oh dear, no. Here is the Colonel come back. See if that girl has got the water hot. He will like his tea early. I am quite sure he hasn't got it ready. What a provoking girl that is, to be sure. She does nothing all day. I must get rid of her. Yes, but she is very ugly. That is one great recommendation in her favor, said Mrs. Merideth. One very great recommendation. It ensures domestic peace, to say the least of it, and there's not so many followers usually. Now, however, we must do the best until we have money. But here he is. At that moment the Colonel entered the house, and proceeded at once to the drawing-room, having first divested himself of his hat and cloak in the passage. Upstairs was a good fire and an easy-chair, with ottomans for his feet, and a comfortable, well-furnished apartment it was. Mrs. Merideth followed him up, and entered the room after him to inquire what he would like done next, and with her assistance he took his boots off and put on a pair of splendid slippers, and reposed with a groan of satisfaction on the chair. I think, Mrs. Merideth, he said, that the best thing I can have will be some tea. Where is Margaret? When she is at liberty, I wish to see and speak to her." "She will be here in a few moments, Colonel," said Mrs. Meredith. "I will send her to you." "No hurry for a few moments," said the Colonel. "Something about the jewels, I'll be sworn," said Mrs. Meredith to herself. "I wonder what he has in that parcel. A present, I dare say." Mrs. Meredith sought Margaret, and related what the Colonel said with his desire to see her, and that young lady at once proceeded to the drawing-room. "Oh, my dear Margaret," said Colonel Devereux, "I see you are pleased to see I have returned. Your very eyes tell me so. Come here to me, dearest." "Ah, my looks, I am afraid, say too much." "Not at all, not at all," said the Colonel. "I love to see them, especially when I know they are sincere. When they come from the heart, you know. I love to see innocent and heartfelt satisfaction beaming from such a face as yours." "Oh, Colonel, you are really too complimentary. Not that I think you don't mean what you say, but your partiality is too great to allow you to judge as a stranger would." "I do not desire to judge as a stranger would. It does not give me any satisfaction. To look upon you with the eyes of a lover is a privilege I most desire, and very soon with those of a husband, and then my happiness will be complete. How I long for the days and the hours to fly by. They cannot go too fast now. By and by they may pass as slowly as you please. That done, then I am quite content, because I shall pass them happily, rapturously." "Ah, you are so kind-hearted, so good, that I can never repay you." "Do not seek to do so. You will only make me the heavier in debt. But come, there is a small parcel, with a few trinkets I have purchased. The jewels I spoke of are in hand, and they will be ready in time for our marriage." "Nay, do not think about them. Do not disturb yourself, Colonel. I am quite content if I am dressed as befits the occasion, but I am really obliged to you for your present, whatever it may be. And I may as well tell you, I have thought, indeed I have said as much, I should like to have a couple of female friends to visit me on that occasion." "Yes, my dear, you may depend upon it. I shall be the more happy when I know you are so too. But no matter, ask whom you please. As far as I am able, I will make them welcome and happy. I suppose, however, you are alluding to your bridesmaids." "I am," said Margaret. "I shall be most happy to see them, or any friend you may desire," added the Colonel. "And will you have no one on the occasion?" inquired Margaret. "Won't you have somebody to keep you in countenance upon the occasion?" "No," said the Colonel, "I shall not. I have no friends with whom I am intimate enough, that I know of, at this present moment. There may be people in London with whom I have been, in India, intimate with, but I do not know for certain. But time and accident will turn up old friends, and I have not the desire to seek them. But if we must have someone, I do not know whether Mr. Twistle would not do quite as well, if he would come, and your mother had no objection." "I am sure she would not. Mr. Twistle was an old friend of my father's, and consequently he would be no stranger at all to the family. Besides, it is his daughter and her friend Martha that I have invited upon this occasion. Have I done wrong?" "Not at all. It could not have happened better. I am sure they must be very worthy people, and any one whom you please, or they know, that you feel disposed to invite, do so, with the confidence that whatever pleases you on the occasion will please me." At that moment there was an alarming rapping at the door, which caused them to pause a few moments. Then they continued their conversation until the servant announced to Miss Meredith that Miss Twistle, her papa, and her friend, Martha, were come. End of chapter 139 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. Read by Richard Wallace. Liberty, Missouri, 14 February 2010. Happy Valentine's Day. Chapter 140 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST. Chapter 140. A Pleasant Evening, The Bridesmaids. "I know how that is," said Margaret before she left the drawing-room. "That was through my ma. I dare say she has invited them to take tea with her tonight. I should not at all wonder about that. I have not seen them for some time. They keep a great deal at home, and visit but little. They are playful, homely girls, but good-hearted, and that is why I prefer them to more fashionable friends, whose goodness of heart I cannot rely upon. They are insincere. You are very right, but you will, I hope, let me see your friends, and unless you have family matters to speak of, perhaps you will take tea up here with me. I shall be all alone if you do not. So, you see, I am speaking from selfish motives. But do not think I shall be at all hurt if you do not see fit to accept the invitation for them. I will accept it for them cheerfully, and shall be much surprised if they do not do so too, said Margaret, as she walked towards the door, and then left the apartment, to proceed first to her own room, and there to examine her present, before she sought the visitors to give them their invitation. The parcel contained some handsome laces and other matters, beautiful and expensive, such things as she could wear and excite the envy of others, which was, of all things, and usually is of women in general, the most enchanting thing in all the world, and gives intense gratification. After admiring for a moment or two the beauties of the laces, she could not help involuntarily exclaiming, "This will be beautiful, so very becoming, and so much above anything else that can be brought by my bridesmaids. I shall be a queen amongst them. Indeed, they will but set me off to the utmost advantage. I shall be the glory of the occasion." Having secured her new acquisition from inquisitive eyes by locking it up in her drawers, she returned downstairs, and then entered the parlor, where, truly enough, as she had imagined, there was Mr. Twistle, Miss Twistle, and Miss Martha, all of whom were dressed out for the occasion. There was some truth in what Margaret had said to her mother, that the two intended bridesmaids were not likely to induce anyone to fall in love with them. They were oddities of the first water. Miss Twistle had light brown hair, bushy eyebrows, a straight masculine nose, a mouth that turned up on one side, and one of her eyes had a gentle inclination to gaze at her nose, while her complexion was increased by a vast quantity of sun freckles. Then, as for Miss Martha, she was another beauty of a similar class, hooked nose, with one eye paying undue attention to the auricular organ, while the other was somewhat injured by a blank appearance. Her hair was red, and she was pitted by the smallpox to a fearful extent. Such were the two friends whom Miss Meredith had chosen for bridesmaids, with the laudable view of putting no temptation in the way of the Colonel, which Mrs. Meredith, her mother, most strenuously advised, as she had experience of the men. "My dear Miss Twistle, and you, Martha! Ah, Margaret, God bless me, who could have imagined, above all things, what I have come about? What can you be thinking and doing? Here you've no friends to help you. I see you have done it all yourself. What can you think of people? You have no mercy." "Aye," said Martha, "there's no doing anything while you are about. No one else has a chance, but you must tell us all about it." "Yes, yes, I will tell you all about it, and more than that, you shall see the Colonel, if you please." "That is what we should like above all things." "Oh, it is a colonel, then, a rich Indian colonel. Upon my word, you will have to be presented at court next." "Ha ha ha! You are joking me now. Well, never mind, I shall joke you some of these days. You may depend upon that. My turn will come next, and then I won't forget you. But seriously, there are more unlikely things may come to pass than that." "Well now, I dare say. Who would have thought of that now? But then, you are so lucky, you see. Only think what might have been the case if the Colonel had been a young man. Why, he might become as great a man as the Marquis of Granby. Why, you'd have been a marchioness then. Why, bless my heart, how things do come about!" "Well, you had better come up to the drawing-room," said Margaret, "and see the Colonel, who is waiting tea for us all. Come, Ma." "Yes, my dear, I am ready. Mr. Twistle, will you come?" "If you please," said Mr. Twistle, "if you please. We shall now soon have the pleasure of seeing an end to this affair, for, as it is to come off, why, when it is over, it will be all the better. Expectation is always a time of uncertainty and anxiety, at least to most people." "So it is, Mr. Twistle, so it is. And I am not without my share of it, for in the first place human life is short, and circumstances may alter cases. So I am anxious to see it over, and offer no impediment in the way of the completion of the marriage. Certainly, you are quite right. Having made up your mind to permit the marriage to take place, why, the sooner the better. They were all now introduced to the Colonel, who was very polite and courtly, which in some degree embarrassed the young ladies, who were compelled to put on, as they expressed it, their best behavior, and so did not become quite so familiar. However, that did not spoil the harmony of the meeting, for the young ladies considered there was more respect paid to them, and the less they were able to appreciate the politeness with which they were treated, the more they believed themselves honored. They were well enough pleased, and the conversation turned upon various matters, while Mr. Twistle was uncommonly attentive to the Colonel. Indeed, he watched him most narrowly, every turn and every expression, as if he were resolved to ascertain, by constant surveillance, whether there was any foundation for his half-inspired doubts respecting him, and also as to whether it were possible that he could have had any hand in the disasters which he had on 2 several occasions suffered. But yet he could see nothing at all that gave him the slightest pretext for persisting in his suspicion. He appeared the same easy, careless individual, who would not trouble himself to consider whether he was watched or not, or whether his actions were the subject of other people's thoughts, or whether they were unnoticed. It mattered nothing to him. It is singular, he muttered to himself, very singular, how it could all happen by accident, and only at moments when I was watching him. I can't tell, and yet the occurrences were of that character. To another they would seem wholly unconnected, and I am unable to connect them save by fancy. But he looks not a very old man, but rather like one who has the full use of his faculties. He is singularly pale, to be sure, and yet at times he does not appear so old, nor does his arm and leg seem quite so bad at others. Perhaps it varies according to circumstance, weather, the moon, or unforeseen changes. He remained cogitating very quietly by himself. He was thoughtful, and could by no means divest himself of the idea that there was something more than common about the Colonel. "He don't seem so blind with that eye as he might," he muttered. "But there is no use calculating about an Indian. They have got such luxurious habits and fancies, that if he fancies one of his eyes is in any degree weak, he will wear a shade for its preservation. Well, he is entitled to do so, but he ain't so old as they imagine, and that will be no detriment to him or to them, so much the better, unless they reckon upon the Colonel's death, which would hardly be an object to them, seeing that it could bring them no more. Indeed, it would diminish their income. But he is a tall man now, and if he did not stoop so much, would yet be a fine man." These thoughts passed through his mind, time after time, during the whole evening, while the Colonel himself was at times conversing in the most refined and courtly language, and doing much towards amusing them with anecdotes of the places he had seen and the battles he had fought. "You would be surprised," he said, "to hear that, in India, there are places so cold that they more resemble the polar regions than Central Asia, of which we only used to think of as being one of the hottest regions in the world, filled with wild animals and numerous serpents. Certainly we hear more of that than anything else, the yellow fever, the cholera, and all these kinds of things caused by exposure to heat. So they are, but it is only in the plains, and not on the high tablelands and mountains, where you gradually meet with more temperate climates, many of which equal northern Europe for salubrity, and further up you come to frozen regions." "Indeed, that is a phenomenon." "Oh dear no, the altitude of the plain and the exposure make the sole difference. I remember once I was sent with some other regiments to chastise some of the hill tribes." "Under whom was that?" inquired the attorney. "General Walker," returned the Colonel. "He was a very able general, and we performed some extraordinary marches under him, as well as some service." "Oh, indeed," said the attorney. "What might have taken place?" "I will tell you an incident that did take place, and not relate more scenes of carnage that we passed through in the execution of our duty than shall be actually necessary. We had, on one occasion, to storm a city, on another a fortified town. It was strong, and well protected by nature and art. Well, we arrived there, and the gates were closed against us. Guns were brought to bear, and men appeared on the walls. We expected, of course, a sharp time of it, and being only the advance guard, we halted for the main body to come up with us, and, after having summoned the garrison to surrender, we put posts and watchers for the night, not expecting to do anything upon that occasion. Nor did we expect the main body up with us till the middle of the next day, they having sent word on to me that they would not be up in consequence of some accident to some part of the train, which would have to be repaired. But a portion of the troops would advance a stage nearer to me in case of an accident, upon which I could retire for support, or send to them to come up as the exigencies of the moment should most require. But they did not anticipate any movement at all. Nor did we. The fact was, we had made a forced march of it, and had got over more ground than we had expected, and our main body did not think we should have been so near the scene of action as we were. However, a council of war was held amongst the officers, and it was resolved that we should attempt nothing without the assistance of our comrades, as the place was very strong, as I have before told you. Well, sir, half the night was over, and we lay fast asleep, having had a hard, very hard day's work of it, so hard that we could sleep sound on the bare earth. We were all suddenly awakened by a loud explosion, which shook the very earth under us, and upon starting up, and rushing out of our tents, we saw the earth and air illumined by the explosion of, as we afterwards learned, and guessed at the moment, one of the enemy's powder magazines. In another minute we found there were plenty of falling missiles, with the debris of the magazine and the mangled corpses of the men who were near it. There was an instant order to muster the men. Everybody knew what was meant. They were all ready in a few moments. Indeed, we slept by our arms, fully accoutred, so it did not take long to be ready for action. We were ordered to form in divisions and bodies, and as there was ample breach made by the explosion there, I was ordered to mount the breach and enter the town for the purpose of assault. We did this. We marched down upon the breach after some difficulties, and were fairly in it, but had our commanding officer known any of the difficulties, he would not have incurred the responsibility of ordering us to advance, for the ruins we had to scramble over were dreadful, and had there been light, we could every one have been picked off by the enemy. Darkness was our friend, and we got into the town with a comparatively trifling loss, and when our men got together they began to tell a tale, for their volleys were well directed upon the enemy, who were drawn up in masses, and whose fire directed ours. We were not completely exposed to their fire, for the same objects that exposed our men, as they were surmounted before reaching the enemy, protected them from immense volleys of musketry. However, we carried the point, and at that moment another explosion took place in some other part of the town, which illumined all around for a moment or two, and then came masses of bricks and stones and timber, killing friend and foe. For a while we were staggered. We did not know what to think of this affair. We knew not whether we had an enemy to fight, or even where he was. We were completely at a standstill. But this did not last long. The defenders fled, and left us masters of the field. We remained under arms all that night, till daylight. Glad were we indeed when daylight came. We were fatigued, so much so that our men could scarcely stand in the ranks. Then parties were sent out to look after the wounded, who had been left in all imaginable situations. It was at such a moment that I was discovered my leg was shattered by a musket bullet. And you lay bleeding all night? Yes, not exactly bleeding, for I had some sense left to me to bind a ligature over the wound to stop the effusion of blood, which would have killed me in a very short time. However, there was no necessity to lose my leg, but it has made me permanently lame. I see you are so, sir, said Twistle. But do you never feel it worse at some times than at others? Yes, I do. There are times when I do not know that I have received a hurt at all, but sometimes I suffer a little, and am a little more lame in consequence." "It was fortunate," said Twistle, "it was your leg, for it might have been your head, you know, and that would have been a death blow to your fortune." "Yes," said the Colonel mildly, "I might have been killed, as you observe, but at the same time I should have done my duty, which in these cases is all we look to. I might have saved a better man, who had a wife and family. I had none." Conversation now ran on the forthcoming event, and Mr. Twistle was invited by the Colonel, and the whole party were well satisfied with each other, and parted very good friends, with the promise of meeting again before the propitious morning which was to unite the fates of Margaret Meredith and Colonel Deverill. End of chapter 140. Read by Richard Wallace, Liberty, Missouri, 25 February 2010.
Chapter number 141 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Thomas Prescott Prest. Chapter 141. A New Character. Miss Twistle's Visitor. The Invitations. Nothing could exceed the smoothness and easiness of the course of things in the wooing of Margaret Meredith. All things appeared so well ordered. People were all of one mind, and it is needless to say that the young lady was elated. She was elated, and we might not be out of the way in saying she was elated overmuch, and knew not how to keep the exhibition of her joy within proper bounds. She could not help showing she was to be the lady of a colonel. Mrs. Meredith, too, was well pleased. What could she do but feel proud at the change that was about to take place? She would go to watering places in the summer, and remain in town during the winter. They would lead a very fashionable life. They would be of the elite, and all their acquaintances would be compelled to cut, or at the most only speak to them when they were unseen by any others. It is astonishing how a change of circumstances produces a change in our habits and feelings. How it happens that those who were considered respectable acquaintances suddenly become the objects of our aversion, and we begin to devise all sorts of methods for evading recognition, or of speaking to them when we can avoid it. This arises merely from a change in one's circumstances, which causes us to look for something much beyond what we have been used to, but unfortunately it brings ingratitude often in the train of its consequence. "My dear," said Mrs. Meredith to her daughter Margaret, "we really cannot know the people at the corner house over the way who invited us to their parties." "Oh dear, no, we cannot think of it, but we must get rid of them in the best way we can. You see, they will not be quite the thing for us when we come to have our change of circumstances, you may depend upon it. It will become necessary to weed one's acquaintance." "Yes, that must be done," said Mrs. Meredith, "and the sooner we set about it, the better. For the more intimate we continue now, the more trouble will there be of getting rid of them afterwards. Certainly we need not accept their invitation for tonight." "Oh dear, no! I have dismissed the whole affair from my mind, and there is no need even of thinking of it any more. I shall not even think of sending them an answer. The consequence will be they will be angry, and expect we shall go and apologize, and when they find we don't, but that we try to get rid of them, they will be baffled, and the whole affair is settled." "That is a very good plan, my dear. Then you know there are the Morgans. We must positively get rid of them. It will never do to have those young men hanging about. The Colonel would do something dreadful, to say the least of it. Why, he would shoot them, and perhaps have a separation, who knows? But then I should be entitled to a maintenance." "You would, my dear, but unfortunately you well know that you have no property, and that, added to an early separation, would put it in his power to offer you and compel your acceptance of a very small sum, which he may pay as he pleases, weekly, monthly, or quarterly." "I see, Ma, but we will run no risk of that kind of thing. Moreover, there would be those girls; they would be a nuisance, hanging about the Colonel." "No doubt, and the cause of unhappiness in the extreme. Better to leave all such people. You are a great deal better without them." Why, I can tell you what, you will be at no loss of company or acquaintances. You will find they will be sure to spring up. Property is sure to enable you to choose those whom you will have, and whom you will not. The reason is obvious enough. Moreover, like loves like, you know, and people with means soon find out people who have none. Yes, Ma, and those who have plenty, besides a colonel and a man of rank and standing, and everybody knows that a colonel in the India service is a rich man, and that would bring us all into the best society. Only think of my going to Bath, Bristol, and Brighton in their seasons. Of course, we couldn't keep company with people who can't afford to go to some fashionable place at least once in a year. Oh dear, no. Certainly not, my dear. But there is no need of our troubling ourselves about that matter. We shall go only when the Colonel goes, and we shan't be seen without him, and he'll be a constraint upon them, and therefore, where they find themselves uncomfortable, they will not come again. That will be a very good plan, for it will appear as their own faults. But at the same time, I do not trust to that upon all occasions. It might fail, and then we should have to take some unpleasant steps to get rid of them, which is certainly easily done, but unpleasant. Yes, yes, certainly, replied the mother, and then suddenly, as a knock and ring came upon the door, Margaret said, "Dear me, who is that? I hope none of these people whom I have been speaking about. It will be a dreadful nuisance to all, especially when I am to be married in 3 days more. You needn't be seen, Margaret. I'll see them. Do, Ma, and I'll go upstairs. But let's hear who it is first. Who comes today?" At that moment she heard the door open and her own name pronounced, and at once knew the speaker, and said to her mother, "Oh, Ma, 'tis Miss Twistle, my bridesmaid. What an infliction! But then I must see her. She has come, I suppose, to consult me about some new gown, or the way in which she and her friend will have their hair done up on the occasion. Nothing more important, I dare say." "Very well, my dear, they had better come in. Send them in, pray," she added to the servant. "Oh, Miss Twistle, how glad we are to see you!" "Now, really," said Miss Twistle, "how kind you are, for I am sure you speak the truth. Oh, Margaret, don't you feel all of a flutter?" "I don't, indeed. I am very comfortable. I hope you are all quite well. Don't put yourself out of the way on this occasion. You need not, I assure you." "Oh, I have got my pa to give us new gowns and some lace, but I did not mean to tell you that. I and Martha had agreed that that should be a secret between us, that we should not say anything about it to anyone, but surprise you on your wedding morning." "Ah, you really have been at a great deal of trouble and expense about this affair, I am sure. You really must not think I wish you to do all this. I really don't know how to scold you enough, for I shall be dressed very plainly indeed." "Oh, but then you are the bride. We ain't, you know, and that makes the difference. Besides which, we have a visitor come up to London to see us." "Indeed! Some young gentleman, I suppose, whose heart you want to run away with, and so have another wedding, and upon your own account this time. And perhaps you are helping Miss Martha to a husband. What is he, a physician or a divine?" "Neither. But I will tell you he is only an old man." "An old man! What a sweetheart you have chosen, to be sure! But I dare say you have your reason as well as other people. But have you known him long?" "No, we haven't done so. But the fact is, Pa and he have had some business together, and they are very much in each other's company. He's a man, however, of great rank, though a very odd man to talk to, I assure you, but a man of rank and property." "Indeed! Oh, tell me, what is he, a lord?" "Well, he is not much short of it, and he is higher than a great many lords, I assure you. Why, he is no less than an admiral, only I wasn't to say anything about it." "Oh, will he be with you when my marriage takes place?" "Yes, he will, and I wanted to know, as he will be much with my father, and as a visitor, shall we be intruding to bring him here to grace your wedding?" "Oh, yes, by all means," said Margaret, who thought the presence of an old man could in no way interfere with any of her schemes. Besides, a man of rank such as an admiral would greatly increase the noise of her marriage. Indeed, here was probably a new acquaintance with whom she could be intimate. Besides, it was some one of consequence on her side that the great man was to come, and would, she thought, add some lustre to herself. "Well, then, I would not ask him until I had seen you, because it might turn out you would be displeased, and as I have not done so, I cannot tell you whether he will come or not. He's a strange man, and I won't ask him until the night before." "Very well. We shall be quite happy to see him. I dare say he'll come, if you tell him who's going to be married." "Indeed, if he's likely to come, I'll invite a few friends to meet him, but I won't say anything to anybody about it." "No, let it be a surprise to them all, and let nobody know whom they are going to meet." "That will be delightful, certainly, very delightful. What a surprise it will be to them to be introduced to the Colonel this and Admiral that! I declare I long for the day on account of the confusion that some persons will be in. I must now bid you good bye, for I've got to call upon my dressmaker to give her some orders." "Will you stop and take tea with us? Surely you won't run away?" "Oh, but I must," said Miss Twistle, and so said Miss Martha, and after much pressing and refusing they parted, and left Margaret filled by other thoughts than those she had so recently held. "Ma," she said, after a long pause, "do you know what I have been thinking of?" "No, my dear, I do not." "Well, then, it is this, that after all we may as well make a bit of a figure of it for the last time, that we will have some friends who will figure upon that occasion, and no other." "What makes you think so, my dear Margaret?" "Why, you see, Ma, we are likely to have a distinguished visitor, and we may as well have as many as we can. Their number and dresses will look well, and as we shall leave town immediately, I don't see that we shall be at any future time annoyed by their visits. Indeed, it will be retiring from their society after giving them a feast." "Well, to be sure, I never thought of that," said her mother. "I never thought of it. What shall we do now? How can we provide for so many?" "Send an order to a pastry cook to provide breakfast for so many, whether they come or not, and then we need trouble ourselves very little about giving them time. If we tell them about the day before, they will have all in readiness for us." "Well, well, and as for the expense, it will be of no consequence." "None," said Margaret. "I shall be able to pay that and others, if we owe any. But now comes the job of inviting visitors, and we must only invite those who will make up a show, dress well, and pass off on the occasion for fashionable people. Oh, as for that, there are many people who never had a penny in their lives to call their own, may be very fashionable-looking people, and pass for men of 1,000 a year, to say nothing of a lord looking like a workman, and the like, which is common enough. Then we'll settle it at that point, Ma, and you had better superintend the invitations and the other affair, the breakfast, I mean." "Very well, my dear, you know that I have no objection. I have seen such occasions before, and I well know what they ought to be. Therefore you may safely rely upon my judgment in such an affair as that, at least." "And about the selection of friends, visitors, I mean?" "That you may also leave to me," said Mrs. Merideth, "and depend upon it, I will not invite one party whom we shall have cause to say we are sorry they came, though you know every allowance would be made for them by the Colonel or Admiral, if he come. By the way, I would not tell the Colonel a word about it, for sometimes the land service hates the sea service, and the latter often laugh at the former, so it will be safest to say nothing. No, Ma, I won't. I didn't intend to do so." Thus both mother and daughter had suddenly changed their views of what was to take place on the day of the intended marriage. They were now resolved they would have as many of their old friends as they could get together upon the occasion, to cause the affair to go off with all the éclat that it was possible. It would be the last ball of the season; that is, it would be the last she ever intended to give them, and that would be the last occasion upon which they would meet. Her respect for Miss Twistle was augmented by the knowledge that she had an admiral for a friend or a visitor, it didn't matter which. Who could tell what might happen? Mightn't Miss Twistle marry an admiral, as ugly as she was, as well as she should a colonel? But there were many reasons why she should. She, too, might have had some means of entangling his heart. Perhaps, after all, she only came there with him for the purpose of showing him off. "At all events," said Margaret to herself, "at all events, he is one that we can keep on terms with, and it will look well to be acquainted with some person of rank. I am, at all events, well pleased it has happened as it has." Mrs. Merideth, on the other hand, appeared to think her daughter's marriage with the Colonel ought to be celebrated by no common rejoicings, that indeed the marriage ought to go off with as much disturbance to the whole neighbourhood as it was possible to make. This could not be better effected than in the manner we have referred to, namely, inviting a number of persons to come and be present at the ceremony, and to take a late breakfast, and to wish the bride joy to see her depart, and then to lose sight of her, as she hoped forever. This purpose Mrs. Merideth ably carried out, and she succeeded in inviting about 2 or 23 persons together, and any person who had a carriage and would come in it was sure of an invitation. That was a passport to the marriage feast. "Well," she muttered to herself, as she reckoned up the number of persons whom she expected to be present upon the occasion, "well, I don't think I have omitted any one who ought to be present, nor have I invited any one who ought not to be here. I shall have a busy day of it, very busy day, but the result is everything. So long as the marriage takes place, and we are really married to an East India colonel, why, we shall do, there can be no doubt of it." This was a consolatory reflection. There was but little else indeed that could be done. Little indeed. The cook had the orders for the entertainment the next day. They had but little to do in the household with that. Indeed, they had extra hands, lest there should be any need of them, as she would not have anything go wrong upon such an occasion for worlds. But there was one thing that gave her some satisfaction, and that was, Mr. Twistle had not been to them lately to give any doubtful counsels. Ever since she had announced her intention of permitting the marriage to take place, he had not been to express any doubts about the matter, but had been a mere spectator, doing all that was necessary. He had forgotten all objection, and never made one. He was perfectly quiescent, but would now and then look very hard at the Colonel, but that was all. He never discovered anything, and all was smooth and pleasant. End of chapter 141.
Chapter 142 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Floyd Wilde. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 142. The Wedding Morning. Disruption of Harmony and the New Acquaintance. The Conclusion. Accident, strange to say, had taken our old acquaintance, Admiral Bell, to the house of a lawyer, there to transact some business, as well as to lodge at his house. The fact was, the old admiral hearing that a brother officer was in trouble, one who had shared with him the dangers of the sea and the fight, he came to town to see, himself, what could be done, and finding the affair beyond his comprehension, or at least beyond his power of personal interference, that, in fact, it required the aid of a third party, and that third person must, of necessity, be a lawyer, he determined to employ the man who happened to be conversant with the circumstances of the case, and this was no other than Mrs. Meredith's friend, Twizzle. However, the Admiral's goodwill toward the race who follow the law, not being so great as his philanthropy, he determined to watch every stage of the proceedings, and to permit nothing to be done without his knowledge, and to see that nothing was neglected. Hearing from Mr. Twizzle the affair that was to take place, a sudden crotchet entered his head, that he should like to be present at the ceremony, and he broached it to Mr. Twizzle, who turned to his daughter to ascertain if it were at all possible. That young lady was desirous of shining among her acquaintances, as one who could introduce an admiral, and who did not like the idea of Margaret Meredith being so fine a lady as she now attempted to make herself appear. Indeed, she would have been willing to have assisted in raising her some species of mortification. She felt more than true pleasure in the disaster that would be the cause of such feelings. There was a very general dislike to Miss Margaret Meredith, and the truth was, she was much more than usually arrogant and proud, and took all imaginable methods of vexing and mortifying those around her. But there is little to be said about that. The consent was brought back to the attorney, who felt somewhat elated at it, and communicated it to the Admiral, with some remarks upon the kindness and condescension of the persons who had done him so much honor. This, however, only had the effect of drawing from the Admiral the word swab, and then he became silent, and did not appear to be at all taken aback by the knowledge that an East India colonel was the bridegroom on the occasion, and one of a very large property and singular behavior. The evening before the marriage was a busy one. The young ladies had to arrange and rearrange all their finery, and the bride herself had the task of seeing how she became her bridal dress, to do an infinity of other little matters, and to contemplate the change that was about to take place in so short a period. A few hours more and she would become a wife. The colonel himself did not in the least fall off in his ardor. He was particularly anxious it should on no account be delayed after the day fixed. A later day he appeared to have the utmost objection to. Indeed, he declared he would do anything if it came but a day or two earlier. However, this was considered impossible, and the young lady was permitted to have her way, though it was expressly stipulated that it should not be an hour after the appointed time, for he declared himself dying with impatience to call her his own. "Now, Ma," said Margaret as she sat talking to her mother the night before, "now, Ma, I hope you will not give any of these people countenance when I am gone, and throw off their acquaintance. You will be firm on this point for my sake." "I will, my dear," said Mrs. Meredith. "I will. Then when I come back, I shall know more of the colonel's mind about where we shall live and how we shall live. He must let me have something handsome. I have no doubt but that he will. He does not appear to be a close-handed man, quite the reverse, and all things considered, we shall be able to make a very agreeable living out of it." "Why, yes, my dear, I cannot doubt it. He is no doubt a man of property, and can well afford us enough, and some sum as pin money, indeed. He is too liberal now to be otherwise by and by. Perhaps he will keep on this house, and pay for proper domestics, and keep a carriage. What a change it will be for us all, and how the neighborhood will stare." "Yes, Ma, they will. But suppose we were to reside out of town. We should have our carriage driving into town, as a matter of course, and now and then sleep in town when we made up a party, or went to the theatre." "Yes, my dear. What time shall you see the colonel in the morning?" "Not before I am ready to go." "To church? Well, but you will have some breakfast with him." "No, he will be in his own room, I dare say, till late. He will scarce present himself before the time has come to start. You know his habits. He does not get up very early, and I do not expect to see much alteration. At 11 o'clock we are to be at church. We breakfast at 9, you know, so we shall have time." "Oh, he is sure to be down to breakfast. There can be no doubt about that, indeed. He must be called for the purpose. Of course, there must be some deviation from a regular rule upon extraordinary occasions like the present." "Well, well, there may be. But have you given all the invitations you intended to give? And have you got answers to them so as to ensure their attendance?" "Oh, yes, that is all safe and fixed. We shall have a good many here by 8:30 in the morning, at the latest. But you must contrive to let me have money very soon, or to send me some up, as I am getting very short, for I have laid out a great deal of money lately, and much more than I could, under other circumstances, spare or afford. Of course, Ma, you will not lose anything by this. I shall take care of you. Not a penny that you have laid out but what shall be repaid, and with a handsome return. But do not think about this. It grows late, and I must to sleep." "Do, my dear, and I will wake you in time in the morning." The morning came, and some of them were about early. Mrs. Meredith was up, and so was Margaret. She could not lie so late as usual. She had done much, and yet she had much to do still. It was really astonishing to see what there was to do. No one would have believed it, and even Margaret became surprised. The morning was now fairly come. The servants were about in the house, and the neighbors were up and about. She could hear her mother chiding and scolding. She could hear the sound of her voice, and she began to believe there was now no time to lose. The hour of 9 was now gone. The knocker and the guests had been heard for the last half hour at the door, and she could hear the voices of the guests below, some of whom spoke audibly enough. Then they soon after descended to the breakfast room, which, by the way, was the drawing room, as there was not enough room below. The colonel, at the same moment, entered the room, and a vast number of congratulations were given and received from side to side with the utmost urbanity and goodwill. The colonel, for the first time, had thrown on one side the green shade which he usually wore, but he looked remarkably pale, though he had still the looks of a hearty and healthy man. The paleness, which seemed to be constitutional, was very extraordinary, but that was explained by the colonel saying that he had been so ever since he had the yellow fever, which had had that effect upon his complexion. There was much rejoicing at the occurrences that were now in progress. Everybody praised the viands. Everything was of the best and first-rate quality, and there were many attendants, which made it so much the better, and the more comfortable, as everybody had an abundance of everything. Mrs. Meredith now shone in the greatest triumph. There was none so great and grand. She patronized everybody and appeared remarkably condescending, considering she was the mother of a daughter who was about to marry a retired East India service colonel. There were few who did not understand fully the nature of the condescension of the lady herself. Besides, she was the presiding goddess of the feast. Among those who had been invited was the Miss Smith and Mr. Smith. This was the young lady who had been so terrified at the attack that had been made upon her the first night that Colonel Devereux lodged there, and on the night he was so terribly vexed and disturbed. Mrs. Meredith had invited them because they were people of means, and Miss Smith could not now do any mischief, because the colonel was pledged to Margaret too far to retract, and as there were several young females, why, the more the better, because it would divert his attention. Miss Smith, however, came out of curiosity, and because it was a wedding party, which is the delight and admiration of all young females, and Miss Smith was no exception. Mr. Smith was civil and polite, and hid his internal dislike to the colonel, which he felt and could not account for it. Neither did his daughter. She had a great aversion to him, but at the same time suppressed it. The colonel was courtly and complimentary, and made civil speeches to such as spoke to him. Indeed, he never for a moment lost his self-possession. He stood in a less stooping posture than usual, and he was considered a tall and handsome man, a fine man. "Mr. Twizzle," said the colonel, "I am happy to see you, especially gratified to see you. You will be witness of my happiness today. You will mark my progress in this affair, and learn what lesson it may teach. That is the way we should pass through life, Mr. Twizzle, is it not? Gain knowledge by experience, and become, in old age, a wise man." "Why, yes, oh yes," said Twizzle, who felt there was something in the remark that touched him to the quick, and he winced under the smart, but he thought it might have been accidentally given, and the colonel was quite ignorant of his disasters, and yet it was a very home thrust, without any previous introduction to it, that made it all the more uncomfortable, and he merely replied, "I am happy to see you, Colonel Devereux, and to see you so happy, and the young lady, who I am sure deserves to be happy. In fact, I think you both deserve happiness, I am sure. I wish you every imaginable joy, and it gives me great pleasure in seeing it." "I am sure you do, sir, but you do not seem to eat and enjoy yourself." "I am so occupied in witnessing the felicity of others that I had forgotten it. Moreover, I expect a friend to be present who happens to be late. He is quite a stranger to all present, and therefore I wish to countenance him as much as I could on that account." "Then I will not press you now. Perhaps you will do me the favor of introducing your friend to me when he comes, yourself, and I shall be most happy to receive him." "Thank you, Colonel. You do me much honor. I will accept of your great kindness, and do myself the pleasure of presenting him to you, and to Miss Meredith, whom I hope to see soon changed in name. I hope the time will now be very short. What hour is it?" "9:30, said the attorney, consulting his watch. "At 11 we must be at the church. Well, if we leave at 10:30, then we shall be there in ample time. I would it were over, and that we were on our journey." "Ah, you are impatient, Colonel," said Margaret, as she came up to him. "My dear angel," replied Devereux, bowing, "how could I be otherwise when you are the object of my affections? It is not impatience to leave this good company, quite the reverse, but it is because the change of scene, travelling, and change of air will do you much good, and is, I can see, quite necessary for you." "I think it will do me no harm," said Margaret, "but here comes Ma, who really looks tired." "Well, my dear, I am a little fatigued, but you know, I shall have ample time to recover myself. I shall have nothing to disturb my repose." "Indeed, Mrs. Meredith," said the colonel, "I am sure we must alter that. We must find some other kind of employment for you, and not suffer you remain hidden at home. You have catered so well for us this morning, that I am sure you are a most valuable acquisition to a household. With such a superintendence as yours, we should have everything in the utmost plenty, and at the proper moment." "Ah, Colonel, you are flattering, you are." "We shall soon show that we are not flattering, I hope," said the colonel. "My dear madame, you are the life and soul of the whole company. What should we have done without you? I hope all your friends are happy and comfortable. I do not know them well enough to pay them all that attention and respect they deserve." "Exactly, Colonel. They all know that well enough, and you are fully alive to the honor you do them in being present in the midst of them." "Who is that young lady who was looking here just now?" inquired the colonel. "Who? The young lady with the elderly gentleman by her side?" "Yes, I should like to be introduced to her," said the Colonel. "Oh, certainly," said Mrs. Meredith, vexed in her own heart that she had invited her and her father now, for she had no wish that any one present should be future acquaintances. But there was no help for it. She must introduce them, and accordingly she went up, with the best grace she could put on, to them both, to request they would be introduced to the Colonel, who desired the honour of their acquaintance. There was no hesitation, of course, and they at once advanced to meet him, and were introduced to the Colonel as Miss and Mr. Smith. "I am most happy to see you, sir," said the Colonel, "and the young lady here is your daughter, I can see, by the family likeness she bears to you." Miss Smith, however, could not repress a convulsive shudder as she looked upon the Colonel. It might have been his complexion, or it might have been that his features brought some terrible recollections to her mind, but she could not for a moment or so speak. "The young lady is ill," said the Colonel, who noticed the emotion. "What is the matter, Clara, my dear?" said Mr. Smith. "What's the matter? You are ill." "No, no," said Miss Smith. "It was a sudden dizziness that came across me, I dare say. I shall be better by and by. I am sorry it should have come upon me now." "Ah, my dear young lady," said Colonel Devereux, drawing up to his full height, and looking gravely, but speaking with the utmost courtesy, "you have nothing to regret respecting the occasion. The illness itself is a matter of regret to us all. I am sure, however, let us hope it will be but temporary, and that you will be able to wish me joy and my beautiful bride. You see, Colonel Devereux, ever since the night she was disturbed by the strange attack of what she believes to have been a vampire, or something that had the form of a man and a taste for blood, she has been affected thus." "Dear me," said the Colonel, "what a shocking thing, a very shocking affair. I think, perhaps, the young lady is subject to illness," and he touched his forehead as much as to intimate an insinuation that the young lady might be somewhat affected in her intellects. "No, sir, quite the reverse," said the father. "I myself saw a tall, gaunt figure gliding away, which felled me in an instant, and I lay half a minute stunned." "God bless me," said the Colonel, "this affair is quite romantic. If a German writer had such material by him, what would he not make of it?" There had been a loud knocking at the door, and someone announced, but nobody took any notice of it. Colonel Devereux did not hear it, but stood talking to Mr. Smith, while Admiral Bell was introduced by Mr. Twizzle, who led him towards the group, explaining what had happened. "By God," said the Admiral, "do you see how they are crowding about the poor girl? Why, they'd extinguish a fire, if there was one. Why don't you give young woman air? If you don't stand on one side, I'll put the whole broadside into you, as I would into a Frenchman." The singular address produced an immediate sensation, and many moved away. "Colonel Devereux," said Mr. Twizzle, "allow me to introduce my friend Admiral Bell to you. Admiral Bell, this is Colonel Devereux." "Eh? Oh, eh?" These later exclamations were uttered in consequence of the extreme surprise depicted on the countenance of both parties. Admiral Bell's surprise was nothing out of the way, but that of Colonel Devereux was a matter of consternation to many of them. He stepped back a pace or two, and his lips parted, as though he would speak, but he could not. He panted, his eye glared, and his nostrils dilated. "Shatter my mainmast, upset the caboose, turn my state cabin into a cockpit, and the quarter-deck to a gambling booth to the whole ship's company." "What's all this about?" exclaimed Mrs. Meredith. "Oh, that odious man! Who is he? What is?" "Why, ma'am, I'm old Admiral Bell, very well known for having beaten the French, and the terror of all vampires. Why, look at the swab. But you ain't going to get off this time." "What is the matter, dear Colonel?" said Margaret. "You are ill. Speak. What is the matter?" "Ah," said the Admiral, "let him speak, and he'll tell you he's no colonel, and his name ain't Devereux, or, if it be, it ain't his only name. He is Varney, the Vampyre." "A vampire!" said Miss Smith, starting up with a shriek. "A vampire! Good heavens! I was not mistaken, then. That must be the man," and she sank back into her father's arms. "What? Has he been at any of his tricks again?" exclaimed the Admiral, and he made a stride towards him. But Varney, for it was he, avoided him by stepping aside, and placing some other person between himself and the Admiral, and then he said, "What this madman will say you will not listen to. You—" "Madman? Well, I'm hanged. Call me a man," said the Admiral, I wish I had my sword by my side, and I would teach you how a madman can fight. But you are not going. I have something to say to you first. If he's going to marry that young lady, all I can say is, she will be food for him. She'll never live till tomorrow. Her blood will make his pale face ruddy." Varney stood no longer, but seeing many around him who appeared to have an inclination to stop his passage, he suddenly made to the door, which he secured for a moment on the outside, and then in another he was clear of the house. This was no sooner done than all present, who were staring at each other in mute amazement, and unable to account for what had happened, looked at the newcomer, the Admiral, who immediately began to relate enough of Varney that made it apparent to all present that he was not what he had represented himself to be. Amid the commiserations of their friends and their jeers, Mrs. Meredith sold all her furniture, and with her daughter retired to some little place, where they opened a small shop, to eke out a living by such means. They were unable even to pay many debts they had contracted on account of this marriage, and they were, moreover, ashamed to be seen by their former acquaintance. End of chapter 142. Recording by Floyd Wilde. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 142.
Chapter 143 of Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Varney the Vampyre, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 143. A scene in Winchester Cathedral. The cathedral robbers. A storm. The vaults beneath the aisle. The flight of the robbers and the resuscitated corpse. The sun had long deserted the horizon, and the good city of Winchester had been buried in darkness many hours, while the moon, though high in her course, was obscured by the hazy clouds that drifted from the southwest. The gusty winds whistled round the walls of the cathedral church, producing an unpleasant sensation, with a foreboding of a coming storm. The inhabitants of the quiet, orderly town were steeped in repose, and a stranger who might by chance have wandered at such an untoward hour abroad would not have found one single ray from any window, save perhaps at one or two hotels, which merely keep open till the London mail pass through, lest any passengers should make their stay at Winchester. Save at these places all were reposing peaceably in their beds, and the tower of the cathedral frowned majestically upon the tombstones below, and upon the surrounding buildings, which appeared to peep upon the limits of the graveyard, while the fir trees that were yet standing bent beneath the blast, as it swept across the low walls, by which the cathedral on one side is bounded. But the solitary churchyard was not without its occupants, living or dead, for its sanctity is invaded by the presence of three men, who emerged from the narrow streets and courts situated between it and the cross, and then, crossing beneath the shade of some object, they stood beneath the low wall which surrounded the churchyard. They paused for several moments, and gazed around them in every direction, and up at the houses that were nearest to them, but there was no sign of light or anything stirring in any of the houses adjacent. "I think all is right tonight," said one of the men to his companions. "Aye, right enough. There will be nobody near us tonight." "No," replied a third, "and if the signs of the weather are good for anything, why, we shall have a rough night, and though that is unpleasant, yet it makes interruptions less likely, and success more certain." "You are right, Josh, we shall have a good job this time." "There then, that will do until we are safe. It's no use talking here. If the old watchman comes around we may have to book it, and then we may not have a chance." "Ha ha ha! As for the old watchman, he is not the fool you take him to be if you imagine him at all likely to disturb himself on such a night as this. He'll sleep in his box till he wakes and finds it is fine." "Well, be that as it may," said the other impatiently, "it is all right now." "Yes, all right. Then just help me over and I'll get down on the other side, while one of you can get up on the wall and hand the tools down to me." "Can't you throw them over?" "I could, but it is not worth while to make any noise, even though we felt sure that it will not be heard. There have been most strange things done in our time, you know, and there's no telling what may happen." "Ah, the dead may come to life, Josh." "So they might, and a pig might fly, but, as they say, it is a very unlikely bird." "Well then, up with you." As he spoke, one of the men gave one of his companions a lift up, and with this aid he got on the wall, and then quietly slipping down into the burial ground, he awaited his companions, one of whom immediately mounted the wall in the same manner, and who received a bag, which he handed down to his comrade, who was in the graveyard belonging to the cathedral. Well, is all right? He said. Yes, all right. Don't stay up there like a cat on a wall. Come down, or you may by chance be seen. The other two men immediately came over the wall, and they all three collected round a monument that stood up, and here a short consultation took place. Now, how shall we proceed? We must get into the vaults somehow or other if we dig our way in, which I think is much the most easily done. What, undermine the building? Scarcely so much as that. Well, but we can get into the body of the cathedral and then into the vaults that way. There is a door. Yes, there is a door, but it is so close to the verger's door that you are sure to awake him. I have opened more than one door in my time, and yet I never awoke anybody in doing so. He must sleep wonderfully light. Aye, so he may, but in this case the door is so strong that there is no chance of breaking it open without great inconvenience and noise. There is no room to work in, and moreover, the verger keeps a little cur always sleeping on the mat close to his door, so that no one can approach without his giving alarm. What a brute! Yes, but there is a means of entering besides that. Where? And how? In the back of the cathedral there is a large marble slab, on which is carved some letters, that I never could make out, but I'm told it says that somebody lies buried underneath that stone, but I know immediately below are the vaults. Well, but the marble you speak of would weigh 14 or 1500 weight, which would be no joke. No, by Jove, said his companion, we had better by far dig our way in, since we shall have so much difficulty in getting in. We can soon dig out soil enough to let us get down into the vaults. Well, we had better set to work at once, lest we lose all chance. If we have a long job, we had better set to work early, as well as stop here, for if we are surprised we shall have to run. And the yard will be watched ever afterwards, as sure as we shall have a storm presently. So we shall. Work away, Josh. Where are the tools? Here they are, said the man, throwing the bag down and opening it, and then he pulled out some tools, consisting of pickaxe and shovels, and a crowbar or two, and several other little materials which were useful upon such occasions. Well now, where shall we commence? Just at the side here. We are safe to get in somewhere where the wall is weakest, for I believe the vaults are all walled in. They must be, to have a secure foundation for such a weight as there must be about it, and, to my mind, we have got a decent job. It's very much like a fortress, and if it was easy to get in this way, we should hear of such things being done much oftener than they are. That is my opinion. And a very good opinion it is, too, until another is heard. But it is no use being faint-hearted. The harder the job, the harder we ought to set at it, that's all. But there are some few things not thought of by others, you know, and it is sometimes the hardest thing in the world to think of the most simple. There's some truth in that. The men having found the spot they most desired, they set about digging and picking it up in good earnest. But it was difficult work, and the soil about the cathedral was very hard, owing to the quantity of rubbish that had been driven or trodden into the earth for centuries, either through accident or design, to harden and secure the permanency of the work around. There were many heavy and large stones, as well as small broken stones, also flint in no small quantity, that every now and then resisted the blows of the pick. Well, I'm thinking we have all three worked half an hour and have not got a foot deep yet. We have not got much deeper, certainly. Do you think we shall get in tonight? Tonight or never, said the third man. You are right, comrade. Shoulder your picks, and then we shall see what way we can make in another half hour. Who can tell? We may come to a softer soil below. This is only the filling up. The men again set to work heartily, but they seemed to have no success. They could not make anything of it. It appeared to resist all their efforts, and the sparks often flew from the blows they made with their tools. The perspiration ran down their faces, and as they paused to wipe their foreheads, they gazed upwards at the clouds. It was heavy, and the wind was blowing fresh, and now and then a heavy spot of rain. By St. Peter, said one of them, I expect we shall have a storm presently. I already feel the heavy drops that fall occasionally, and if one may judge by them of what we may expect, we shall have it heavily. So much the better, we shall have less interruption. Well, I don't know what you call interruption, but this is a complete stopper. I can't make any impression with the pick. It is as hard as rock. And then come some of those old walls that are rather harder than granite. You may as well pick at a cartload of pig iron. As this was said, the clouds suddenly appeared to open, and such a deluge of rain descended that the earth seemed to smoke. The drops appeared to be continuous small spouts of water. A shower is too mild a word. It was a deluging, as if some waterspout had burst. The men stood a moment or two, but it was useless to work. They could not do it, and they rushed to a part of the wall which sheltered them from the fury of the storm that was raging. Well, I never saw anything like this before. Nor I. Hark at the thunder. There's a flash. Who would have expected that at this season of the year? Not I. nor anyone else. But it seems to me as if we were to be defeated tonight. I am sorry we made the attempt, since we are sure to find the yard watched after this, for they will see what we have been up to. Yes, it is vexing, but we cannot help this. It is quite impossible to do anything in such weather as this. I do not care about a wet jacket, but I cannot see, and hardly breathe, with so much falling water about me. Nor I, but yet I am loath to give it up. Consider the jewelry and the money he had about him. It will pay us handsomely. Well, it was a strange start of him at all events. I wonder how he came to be buried in such a manner. How was it? I don't know. All I know is that the thing was kept secret because it was considered that it would be a temptation to disturb any grave when it was known that he was buried in his clothes and jewelry, and that his money was buried also with him. It was certainly a temptation I could not resist. Are you sure? Yes. I will tell you, another time, how I came to know all about it. Indeed, I saw him screwed down, and the consequence is, I know that he has the money and the valuables about him. Then I am sure we had better get into the church itself. We can do more with your slab of marble than on the outside of the wall, and besides that, I do not think that this rain will give over. The hole we have already made is fast filling up with water, and we shall find it impossible to work. So we shall. What do you say to getting inside the cathedral? Agreed, my lads, as quickly as you like, for if we stay here much longer, we shall certainly be drowned. I'm wet through as it is. So am I, but never mind, my boys. Bright gold and jewels will warm your hearts, and that will keep your outsides dry, or at least you will not feel it. I am sure that I should not if I can but get it. Aye, that is all I care about, but if you get foiled, you may depend upon it you don't feel any better. You are rather worse, and feel everything more. But what do you say to yon window? That will do if we can reach it. That is my only difficulty. That is one that is easily overcome, said his companion, for I know where the ladder is, and that is just over our heads. All you have to do is put the point of the crowbar under the staple to which the chain is fastened that secures it, and then you have the means at once of entering. But if we get in and are detected, how shall we get out again? Are we not 3 to 1? If the old verger should come, I think we could make a dead body of him in a very short while, and I cannot tell where you will be if you can't get the better of the old man. Well, say no more about it. Up with the ladder, and we will get in and chance it. Such a night as this, it would be strange indeed if anybody heard us, but as there is much to be got, why, we can't grumble at the risk. The 3 men set to work about wrenching the staple out to which was attached a chain which secured the ladder. That was soon effected, and the ladder placed against one of the lowermost windows, and then one of the men went up, and forcing the window open, said, after he had looked in, "All right, come up. We have got to the right place." They all 3 came up, one after another. When the first up crept in at the open aperture, and by means of ornamental work, and a monument that there projected from the wall in a manner that enabled them to descend with ease, and in a few moments more the whole 3 stood in the old cathedral of Winchester. At that moment the bell tolled heavily the hour of 12. The sound was solemn, and it made a deep impression upon the robbers. "What a dismal, hollow sound that has, to be sure," said one. "Yea, it sounded like tolling." "Pshaw!" said one of them. "'Tis no matter, if it be tolling it is not for us, nor for the man we come to visit, so no more old women's fears. If you don't like stopping in this place, you had better set to work and be quick, when we shall have no further need of staying. Of what use is it for you to stare and gape about with white faces and swelled eyeballs like so many cats? Be men. Be active, and use your arms." "Well, where are we to use them? What are we to do? You brought us here, and yet you do not tell us what we are to do. You know all about this matter, and you cannot or do not point out where we are to commence." "Here, then, on the very stone you are standing. Set to work to raise this, and then we shall soon find our way into the vaults below, and we shall then satisfy ourselves for our trouble, and be well paid too, I hope. I hope so too, Josh, for, to tell you the truth, I don't ever recollect so uncomfortable a job as that which I am in tonight." "Well, you ain't got paid all, I'll warrant." "I haven't got paid at all yet, but we waste time. Lend me a pick. I don't see how I am to get a tool in here. The chinks are all so small that you can hardly put in the blade of a penknife." "There is a hole somewhere near the head. There is a small piece of black marble." "Yes, here it is." "Well, chip that out, and then you may insert a crowbar or a pick beneath the stone, when you will find that it will lift up, and then by main strength lift it back, and we may go down." These instructions were followed out. The black marble was discovered and then knocked out, when a large crevice was discovered, into which a powerful crowbar was immediately thrust, and then by one united effort they contrived to lift the marble slab up out of its place, though not above a foot, which required a great effort, when it is considered that it was embedded in cement. Well, we shall be able to get it up now, I think. Don't be too sure, for we have not got it far. It is enormously heavy, and the lever has done all as yet. Well then, are you all ready? A long pull, you know, comrades, and a strong pull does the business. Now then, all together. Heave ho! Whispered another, and they all three made a prodigious effort. It was not only a strong pull, but a very long pull, for the stone was so heavy it came slowly and unwillingly upwards, and it was nearly 3 minutes before the enormous mass stood upright in the aisle. Well, I didn't think it would have been done. That's the hardest job that ever I had a hand in, and don't desire to have such another, but yet, hard as it is easier than what we had to do outside. Yes, much, and you will soon find it so. Lend a hand to clear away the rubbish that lies here. There's a trapdoor underneath that leads into the vaults. It belonged to the monks of old, of whom it is said it served either for the same purpose of burial or for a cellar of wine. Well, well, there are some things better than wine, I trow, in the cellar. Now, if we can find the coffin. There has been no other burial in the vaults since he was buried, so we shall not have much trouble. But what are we to do with the stone? If we let it down again, we shall do some mischief. We must turn it corner by corner until we get it against the pillars, and there leave it. For if we let it down, it will go down like the report of a gun, and smash all that comes in the way. That was agreed to, and it was not long before they propped the heavy mass of stone against one of the pillars, and then returned to the place where it had been raised, and began to clear away the rubbish, when a trapdoor was plainly observable, and after much labor and force they contrived to open the door, where there appeared a dark aperture, into which they could not look without some misgivings, for nothing could be seen. Well, who's to go down? This was a question that no one liked to answer, and certainly no one would volunteer to go below. It was too dark to be inviting, and the men looked at one another as well as they could, for it was total darkness, or nearly so, in the aisle, and below it was so utterly dark that it was impossible to make out anything. What is to be done now? Have you got the lantern? I have, and matches, but did not think we ought to use them before, lest we attract attention. However, we will have a light now, and should anybody look down, they will think there is a general meeting among the dead. So saying, he lit the lantern, which threw a light into the vault, and rendered visible a flight of steps that ran up to the opening, but which were invisible in the darkness that had reigned in the place. Now then, jump down and see where the last coffin is placed. It is easily known from all the others, for I don't think there has been a burial here for many months. The old cathedral is not often disturbed for the reception of the dead, and only when some rich man dies and fancies he may lie more comfortable here. Aye, rich men can afford to be buried in a good suit of clothes, and money in their pocket to bribe St. Peter to open the gate. Ha ha ha! Well said! Peter has the keys. Yes, and here we have the coffin. Have we? Is this it? Yes, don't you see that it has all the signs of newness about it? There is hardly any dust collected upon it. Here we shall find our treasure. The coffin is a strong one, and will, I think, take some trouble to break open. Indeed, we shall be choked with the horrible stench which we have below. I can't stand it another minute. I shall be sick. Aye, and I too. Here then, I have the lantern. Lay hold of the coffin and bring it upstairs. We can carry it amongst us. Aye, anything but remain here. That I cannot do. Be quick, for confound me, but such a mass of putrid flesh as there must be here is horribly sickly. I would sooner be hanged than pass an hour here. I'm not so afraid of death as all that. I could manage to live through a night. You might, but you would soon find out the ill effects, and die of some fever or other, and that is what we shall have if we remain here much longer. The three men then shifted the coffin from its place, and then onto their shoulders, one at either end, and one under the center. The coffin was heavy, very heavy, and the men were tottering under their burden. They were strong men, but hardly equal to the task of carrying so dead a weight, but yet they never shrank from it, but, with slow and unsteady steps, they gradually neared the stairs that led upwards. They paused. If it was a task before, it was worse now. What more exertion could they make? Do you think the steps will hold us? Said one. I'm sure I cannot say, and perhaps not. I think they are rotten, or partially so. What do you say? How shall we get the body up? There is a rope, is there not? Yes. That will do, then. I will get that. By its means we may hoist the coffin up to the stone pavement above. I'm almost sick. And I, too. This place is enough to breed a pestilence in a town. The smell in the vaults was certainly very strong and very pernicious. The fetid odor that rose from the vaults was especially disagreeable. The smell that comes from the accumulated and putrefying remains of human bodies is of all odors the most noisome and, to our tastes, the worst. Right glad were the men who had propped the coffin up against the ladder, to get up into the aisle above, to breathe a less impure atmosphere. They gasped again, and one of them climbed up the monument to get to the open window, at which they had entered, to inhale some of the pure moistened air, and then, after a few inspirations, he returned, at the call of his comrades, to aid them. The rope was procured and secured round the coffin, and one man remained below to guide it, while the two others remained above to haul up the rope, which would bring the body, coffin and all, to the top. "Well, Josh, how goes the storm?" "It is blowing over, I think. It does not rain, and it is breaking. I shouldn't wonder if we don't have moonlight after all, and if we should, we shall have trouble to get away unperceived." "You forget what hour it is." "Hark! There are the chimes." The 4 quarters now chimed from the great clock, and sounded solemnly and mournfully in the dead of the night. The iron tongue struck 1, and the last sounds of the clock died away before any of the men moved or spoke. "Well, we have been here an hour, and nearly 2 hours since our first commencement. It's nearly time, I'm thinking." "Yes," said the man below. "Heave ho!" called out the leader of the gang in a low voice. The 2 men at the top hauled at the rope, while he below pushed the coffin up with all his strength, and after a time they succeeded in causing it to rise about a foot, or something less, at each haul, and as it got higher, the man below could better apply his strength to it, and at length it came up to the top. Here, however, they experienced another difficulty. It was hard to pull up so high as to enable them to throw its weight on the pavement, and the rope was almost useless as a means of pulling it up higher, and the only one who had it in his power effectually to apply his strength was the man below. However, after a while, to their great relief, the coffin lay fairly upon the stone pavement. "A good job done." "So say I, Josh, and such another would completely finish me for the night. I might lie down and defy the world." "How about the coffin? There is no time to rest. I have a small flask of rum in my pocket, which we will discuss as soon as we have broken open the coffin, which I expect is the last hard job we shall have. And a hard job it would have been had I not come provided with a screwdriver, one that is used by undertakers in such work. Set to work. Good luck to you. I am quite dry and quite tired too, and the sooner this is over the better. There, the screws come out easily enough, though they are long and hold firm. Yes, they go deep, but they have a wide worm that carries them down or brings them up so quickly." In a few minutes more the whole of the screws were drawn, and the lid of the coffin was thrown on one side, and the corpse was at once discovered to them. It lay calm and quiet, but yet it was terrible to look at. The living man had been tall, remarkably tall, as well as remarkable looking. He was dressed as if for walking. It was strange, the corpse was apparelled as if were in life, and this, perhaps, caused the extreme paleness, even extreme for a corpse, to be so apparent that they spoke not, but gazed in silence upon it, until at length one of them said, "Put out the light. We have the moon's rays. At least there is enough to enable us to see what we want, and the light is dangerous." The light was put out, and the subdued light of the moon rendered all apparent enough to the robbers. The storm had lulled and altogether ceased, while they had been busy in the vaults and getting up the body, and now it was a perfect calm. The moon, though obscured at the moment, promised to shed her rays upon the earth, and as it was at the full, and the clouds clearing off, the probability was that the town would become as light as day. "There he is," said one of the men. "Yes, and about as ugly a chap as ever I saw." "He is no beauty, but he's been a fine man." "If you mean tall, I dare say you are right, but he's not as fine as I take it. He's not quite full enough about the chest and shoulders. He's got some fine rings, and a gold watch and chain. Well, there is a good 10 or 15 pounds each, and if his pockets are well lined, why, he will afford us a tolerable good booty. Yes, we must not complain. Shall we replace all?" "It is not possible to do so either in time to enable us to escape, or to do it so as to escape detection. Besides, there would be no use in it. See how bright the moon is getting. We shall have as much to do as we shall get through to escape being seen. I am sure we shall run a great risk." "I think so too." "Well then, commence proceedings. Ha!" The moonbeams had fallen upon the corpse just as he was speaking, and he thought he observed a motion in the body. "What is the matter, Josh?" "Didn't you think he moved?" "Ha ha ha ha! Dead! Ha ha! Dead moved! Buried moved! Ha ha ha! Eh? Why? Oh, it's all fancy. You'll see me believe it presently, I do declare. Well, a man dead and buried, I suppose a week. No, I think so. Well, it does not matter much how long he has been buried, but he can't move unless you move him. Damn!" As he spoke, he started to his feet, and his hair began to straighten, and his limbs quiver, and yet he appeared to think he might be mistaken, for he endeavored to speak to his companions. Pointing to the corpse, he contrived to say, I, I, I take the jewels. He moves. Eh? Well, I told you I thought so, but you said no, and only laughed at me for doing so. But stand on one side, and let the moonlight come down upon him. We can tell better than if he really does move, though notwithstanding all I saw, am inclined to believe it is quite an impossibility, but the more light we have, the better we shall be able to tell how the mistake arose. I thought I saw his eyes move. As he spoke, he moved on one side, as he had been standing between the corpse and the moon's rays, and for the most part intercepted them. But the moment that he did move away, and the rays came full upon the corpse, a shivering motion appeared to pervade it, to the intense horror of the robbers, who could not believe what they saw, but believed they were mistaken, though they were too much terrified to speak or even move. They stood gazing upon the body with bursting eyes and gaping mouth, as if they had suddenly become spellbound by the wand of some magician. Presently the corpse opened his eyes and glared full at them. Oh, such glistening, lead-like orbs that froze the very current of their blood! They knew not what to think, but when the body turned on one side, towards the moon's rays, all doubt vanished, and the spell was broken. "The devil bite!" exclaimed Josh. Not another word was uttered by either of the other two, but they sprang like emancipated madmen up the slippery sides of the monument and out at the windows, as easily as a fly can run up a wall. It did not occupy more than a few seconds to enable them to clear the place. Half a minute had not elapsed before they stood shivering by the beautiful old cross at Winchester. The corpse in the cathedral, which mysteriously became animated when exposed to the moonlight, turned towards the moon's rays, and gazed upon the flying and terrified robbers who had just exhumed him. No word passed his lips, and he looked around him for some time in silence upon the scene before him. The moon came in at the tall windows of the cathedral, throwing long streams of silvery light upon the stone flooring, and upon some of the monuments that were erected by the pillars, or columns that rise to the roof. All was silent, all was still, no movement was discernible, save in the form that now sat up, and leaned on his elbow in his coffin, and he but turned his head slowly from side to side, as though he were meditating upon the lovely and solemn beauty of the place. At length he arose, but he appeared to move with extreme difficulty, and once or twice he placed his hand in the region of the heart, as if he felt something there that pained him, and tottered about, but seemed to recover himself a little after a time, and muttered to himself, in low but distinct tones, "I must have been another victim. I am weak, the vital action is languid, and my veins are empty. I must satisfy the instinct of my nature, and another victim must restore me to life and the world for a season." He looked up towards the window, gave one look around him and on the coffin, while a shudder passed through him, and then gazing on himself and feeling for his valuables, he slowly clambered up the monument, and carefully got through the window, and thence into the open air, and he finally disappeared from Winchester churchyard. End of chapter 143 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. Read by Richard Wallace, Liberty, Missouri, 29 April 2010.